Tonight, we'll travel back in time, to an era of fear, mystery, and survival. We'll explore how people, centuries ago, tried desperately to cure one of the deadliest diseases in human history, the plague. From strange remedies and sacred rituals to quarantine, prayer, and even dancing, we'll uncover the many ways humanity fought against the unknown. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let this quiet journey through the past ease you into rest. But before we continue, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down below where are you watching from and at what time. This is the story of how people tried to cure the plague. The word plague doesn't just describe one disease. It conjures up a deep, ancestral fear, an invisible killer that spread like wildfire, snuffing out entire families, towns, and regions in mere weeks. For most, the term refers to the Black Death of the 14th century, though the disease itself resurfaced multiple times over centuries. The Black Death alone, which began around 1347 and raged for several years, claimed the lives of an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. In some cities, up to 60% of the population perished in just a few months. Imagine living in a time when the world seemed to unravel in front of your eyes. Entire villages vanished, markets shuttered, and the comforting rhythms of daily life, harvests, church bells, town gatherings, were swallowed by the tide of death. The air smelled of rot and smoke. The rivers carried not just fish and driftwood, but corpses. And all the while, no one really understood why it was happening, how it spread, or what could be done to stop it. It wasn't just the death toll that was horrifying, it was the swiftness and mystery of it all. Someone could be laughing with neighbors in the morning and dead by nightfall. A child might watch their parents collapse, never to rise again. The strongest knights, the holiest monks, the most learned doctors, all were brought to their knees by a disease that paid no heed to rank or piety. Royalty died alongside peasants. Churches ran out of candles. Graveyards ran out of space. The living envied the dead. In desperation, people turned to anything that promised hope. Remedies, prayers, magic, anything. With science still in its infancy and medical knowledge based largely on guesswork, superstition, and tradition, the line between treatment and ritual, between medicine and madness, blurred quickly. There was no coordinated healthcare system, no emergency task force, no germ theory, just humans, terrified, confused, and clinging to whatever they could, trying to survive a world turned upside down. The plague struck at multiple points in history. While the Black Death of the 14th century was its most infamous outbreak, it returned in waves, each time sparking fresh panic and fresh efforts to understand, contain, and cure it. From the Justinian Plague of the 6th century to the Great Plague of London in 1665, to smaller yet still deadly outbreaks in between, the story of how people tried to cure the plague is not just a medical history, it's a psychological one. It is the tale of human resilience, desperation, ignorance, and creativity in the face of one of nature's deadliest forces. Over the next 4 hours, we will step back in time, into the sandals, boots, and clogs of those who faced this invisible enemy. We will walk through the narrow, winding alleys of plague-ridden towns. We will peer into the smoky chambers of apothecaries and the flickering candlelit corners of churches. We will listen to the cries of flagellants, the soft chants of monks, the whispered incantations of village healers, and the confident proclamations of learned doctors. You will see the world not through the eyes of modern science, but through the lens of people who didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or antibiotics. You will witness the ways people fought back, sometimes wisely, sometimes wildly, often desperately, against an unseen killer. This is the story of how people tried to cure the plague. Now we journey into the minds of those who lived through the nightmare, trying to make sense of it with the limited tools of knowledge they had at their disposal. Let us now explore what people thought caused the plague. The year is 1348. Panic has spread faster than the disease itself. In one village, a crowd gathers around a priest as he solemnly announces that God's wrath is upon them. In another, townsfolk hang aromatic herbs above their doorways, convinced the air itself has turned against them. And across Europe, astrologers peer at the skies, reading celestial signs for clues. Theories about the plague's origin multiplied like rats in a granary. But these were not idle speculations. They shaped everything from public policy to personal behavior, and most importantly, they guided how people tried to cure or avoid the disease. The miasma theory: the air itself had turned foul. The most widespread and deeply entrenched belief was the miasma theory, the idea that the plague was caused by bad air. In Latin, miasma means pollution or defilement, and that's exactly what people believed the air had become: corrupted, rotting, and deadly. It wasn't entirely baseless. People often got sick near sewage, garbage heaps, or stagnant water. But without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, people assumed it was the odor, not the invisible microbes, that caused illness. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers believed that putrid smells emitted invisible vapors or poisonous airs that entered the body through the nose or skin, corrupting the humors inside. This belief wasn't a back-alley idea. It was held by top physicians and scholars of the day. The foul airs were thought to rise from decaying organic matter, unburied corpses, open sores, rotting food, marshes, and even bad weather. In plague times, the scent of death was everywhere. It wasn't hard to imagine that breathing it in would spell doom. Because of this belief, people carried all manner of things to filter or counteract the noxious air. They pressed posies to their noses, held oranges studded with cloves, and burned incense, herbs, or pine resin. Plague doctors' beaked masks, filled with aromatic substances, were designed for this very reason. Not to protect from germs, which they didn't know existed, but to purify the air they breathed. Towns even lit large bonfires of aromatic wood, hoping to cleanse entire neighborhoods. And when the air turned humid, still, or foggy, when winds blew from the south, or the sky darkened with storms, fear would rise. The weather itself became a harbinger of death. Doctors advised people to stay indoors during these times, to avoid drinking hot liquids, or to keep cool to avoid opening the body to the toxic vapors that drifted unseen but deadly. Punishment from God, a divine reckoning for humanity's sins. If the air was not to blame, then surely it must be the heavens. Many people believed the plague was a form of divine punishment, a scourge sent by God to chastise humanity for its sins. In a deeply religious world, this interpretation made complete sense. The Bible was filled with stories of pestilence and wrath, plagues upon Egypt, divine punishment upon Sodom and Gomorrah, apocalyptic visions from the book of Revelation. The plague, then, was not just a disease, it was judgment. Priests and monks preached fiery sermons warning people to repent. Moral decay, they claimed, had angered the Almighty. The greed of merchants, the lechery of the townsfolk, the pride of kings, all had provoked divine retribution. People turned inward with guilt and fear. Confessions surged. Churches filled with wailing penitents. Processions wound through the streets with prayers and lamentations, asking for forgiveness. Flagellants, religious zealots, appeared in many towns, especially in the Germanic regions. These men and women believed that by physically punishing themselves, they could atone not just for their own sins but for the sins of humanity. They marched from town to town, whipping themselves in bloody parades of piety, chanting hymns and begging God to relent. Sometimes, they gained mass followings. Other times, they were chased out of town, seen as dangerous fanatics. But their message resonated. The plague was a test. Or worse, a sentence. Others turned to more tangible symbols of religious faith. They wore crosses and relics around their necks, painted sacred symbols on their doors, or made pilgrimages to holy sites. Monasteries and convents overflowed with people seeking shelter and spiritual aid. Some even believed that only a complete transformation of society, moral, spiritual, and legal, could appease God's anger and bring the plague to an end. Planetary alignments. The sky foretells disaster. While some looked downward at sin and decay, others looked upward. The stars, they believed, held answers. Astrologers and scholars of the time insisted that the heavens could reveal the origins of disease. After all, weren't eclipses and comets always signs of great upheaval? Wasn't the alignment of the planets known to affect everything from weather to temperament? In the early 14th century, many pointed to a rare planetary conjunction in 1345, when Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter aligned in the constellation of Aquarius, as the trigger for the plague. This wasn't dismissed as mere superstition. In fact, the University of Paris, one of the most respected institutions of learning at the time, published a widely circulated report blaming the alignment of these planets for corrupting the air and disturbing the balance of the elements on Earth. This scientific explanation spread rapidly, shaping both the public understanding of the plague and the advice physicians gave to patients. Astrological charts were drawn and studied. Some people avoided surgery, bloodletting, or even leaving their homes during specific planetary movements. Certain dates were marked as more dangerous than others, and people took extreme caution during these celestial events. Even kings consulted court astrologers to determine when it was safe to travel, hold council, or open the city gates. The belief that the heavens could influence human health was not fringe science. It was deeply woven into the fabric of medieval medicine and philosophy. The body, the earth, and the stars were thought to be interconnected. If the balance of the cosmos was disturbed, so too would be the balance of life below. Other theories, from the logical to the ludicrous, beyond miasma, divine punishment, and celestial interference, people clung to other theories as well. Some blamed foreigners, outsiders, or religious minorities. In many towns, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific massacres and pogroms. These accusations were not just dangerous, they were often state-sanctioned, reflecting the desperation and paranoia that ruled the day. Others suspected animals. Dogs, cats, even snakes were killed en masse in some regions, believed to be carriers of the disease. Ironically, this may have worsened the problem, as fewer cats meant a booming rat population, the real culprits in the spread of bubonic plague via fleas. Still others thought earthquakes had released poisonous fumes from the earth's depths, or that certain foods, like garlic, onions, or overly ripe fruits, made people more vulnerable. Advice varied wildly: eat less meat, eat more meat, drink wine, don't drink wine, sleep on the ground, never lie down. In a world without microscopes, antibiotics, or any reliable form of scientific testing, people relied on what they could observe: smells, weather patterns, stars, and scriptures. And from these pieces, they tried desperately to piece together a puzzle whose edges they couldn't even see. But while the causes remained mysterious, the effects were all too real. The next logical step was to act, based on whatever belief one held, hoping, praying, guessing at what might save a life, or at least delay death. Let us now turn our attention from beliefs to biology, not from the lens of modern microbiology, but through the distorted, haunting lens of the past. Though medieval people didn't know the difference between bacteria and spirits, between septicemia and sin, they did notice patterns. They saw how the disease spread, how it manifested, and how it killed. And even without microscopes or blood tests, they could distinguish between the types of plague simply by observing its horrifying symptoms. Today, we know that the plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, often carried by fleas that fed on infected rats and then bit humans. Once inside the body, this bacterium could take different pathways depending on how it entered and how it spread. That's how we define the three main types of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Each one was distinct in appearance, symptoms, speed, and fatality. But to the terrified victims of the past, they were all equally feared. Bubonic plague, the most iconic and widespread form. Imagine waking up with a headache, a fever, and chills. You feel sore, tired, confused. You think it might be a cold or exhaustion, until you notice a strange swelling, usually in the groin, armpit, or neck. At first, it's just tender. Then it grows, reddens, and darkens. The skin becomes taut and shiny over the lump, which fills with pus and blood. Soon, it feels as if your body is burning from the inside out. This was the classic bubonic plague, named after the buboes, large, painful lymph node swellings, that were its defining feature. These buboes could grow to the size of eggs or even apples. They turned from red to purple to black. Some burst open on their own. Others were lanced by desperate physicians, sometimes using heated iron or crude blades. The pain was unbearable. The smell, worse. The fear, inescapable. The bubonic form was the most common during the Black Death and later outbreaks. It typically developed 2 to 6 days after a person was bitten by an infected flea. Other symptoms included fever, chills, vomiting, muscle aches, exhaustion, and sometimes delirium. The progression varied. Some recovered if their immune systems were strong or the bacterial load was small. Others died within a few days, especially if the buboes turned gangrenous or the infection entered the bloodstream. People who had this form of plague could survive, but survival rates were grim. With modern antibiotics, the fatality rate is low. But in the 14th century, without any effective treatment, around 60% of bubonic plague victims died. And the death was far from peaceful. To people of the time, the appearance of buboes marked a person as cursed or doomed. Families fled from their sick. Servants abandoned their masters. Children were left alone in dark rooms with no one to comfort them. The sight of the blackened, swollen buboes came to symbolize death itself, inescapable, grotesque, and near. Pneumonic plague, the most contagious and terrifying form. But there was something even worse. Something quieter and more invisible. If bubonic plague was the monster you could see on your skin, pneumonic plague was the phantom that slipped through the air and into your lungs. This form of the disease developed when Yersinia pestis infected the lungs, either directly through inhalation or when the infection spread internally from another part of the body. Pneumonic plague could be primary, infecting the lungs first, or secondary, after developing from bubonic or septicemic forms. In either case, the results were terrifying. Victims of pneumonic plague began with fever and chills, as with other forms. But soon they developed a relentless cough, chest pain, and extreme difficulty breathing. Their breath grew shallow, their lips and fingertips turned blue, and within a day or two, they began coughing up blood, frothy, bright red at first, then dark and clotted. This form of the plague could kill in just 24 to 48 hours. It was more contagious than any other form because it spread directly through airborne droplets. A single cough from an infected person could infect those nearby. And unlike the flea-borne bubonic plague, pneumonic plague could flourish even in the coldest winters, jumping from person to person through shared air in homes, churches, or crowded plague houses. In medieval times, this form terrified people the most. Not only did it strike quickly and kill painfully, it left no visible buboes, meaning a seemingly healthy person could collapse suddenly, blood pouring from their mouth. Entire households died within days. Hospitals became morgues. Priests and nurses contracted it almost immediately. Communities responded with panic. Victims were locked inside their homes, doors barred and windows nailed shut. Some doctors refused to approach their patients. Towns ordered anyone caught coughing or spitting in public to be imprisoned, or worse. The fear of contagion turned neighbor against neighbor, brother against sister. People ran from coughing sounds as if death itself were calling. Today, we know that pneumonic plague is the only form that can be transmitted directly from person to person. But in the Middle Ages, people could only guess, and most of them assumed the air was to blame. Ironically, that fear of bad air was closest to the truth when it came to this particular form. Septicemic plague, the silent killer in the blood. And then, there was the deadliest form of all. The one with no warning. No swellings. No cough. Just death, sudden, brutal, and certain. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream and multiplied rapidly, poisoning the body from the inside out. It could develop on its own or as a complication of bubonic or pneumonic plague. In many cases, people died before they even knew they were sick. Symptoms included high fever, chills, abdominal pain, vomiting, and bleeding into the skin and other organs. The most horrifying symptom was the discoloration of the skin. It turned black in patches due to internal bleeding and necrosis. This symptom is believed to be the origin of the term Black Death. Victims sometimes experienced seizures or coma before succumbing. The death rate for septicemic plague in medieval times was nearly 100%. Even today, without antibiotics, it's almost always fatal. In the past, people simply dropped dead in the street or in bed. A man might be tending to his fields in the morning and be cold, still, and blackened by sunset. No warning. No hope. This form was the least understood at the time, precisely because it was so invisible. Bubonic plague at least gave people something to see. Pneumonic plague gave them something to hear. But septicemic plague struck silently. By the time its effects were visible, it was already far too late. The sheer terror of this form cannot be overstated. It deepened the paranoia. It strengthened the belief that the plague was an unstoppable curse, a phantom that could strike at any moment, in any place, without cause. And for most, that was exactly how it felt. Together, These three forms of plague created an atmosphere of total, inescapable dread. No one felt safe. Every symptom, every cough, every itch sparked terror. Entire cities emptied overnight. Fields went untended. Commerce ground to a halt. And because people didn't know what caused the plague, let alone how it worked, these forms of the disease seemed like different demons in the same infernal army. But no matter how the plague struck, through skin, lungs, or blood, people tried to fight back. They turned to the tools of their time, ancient theories, medieval medicine, folk remedies, divine intercession. And perhaps the most dominant of those ancient beliefs was the idea of the humours, the key to understanding the body, and thus, hopefully, the plague. To begin to understand how people in medieval times tried to treat something as complex and devastating as the plague, we must first immerse ourselves in their understanding of the human body. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't know what germs were. They had no idea what bacteria or viruses were, or that a flea bite could carry a microscopic killer into their bloodstream. What they did have was ancient philosophy, and one of the most influential systems of thought that shaped their entire approach to health was the humoral theory. The theory of humours was inherited from the Greeks, especially from the works of Hippocrates and Galen, whose writings dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years. According to this model, the human body was governed by 4 primary fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these was thought to correspond with a particular element of nature: air, water, fire, and earth respectively, and each humour had specific qualities. Blood was hot and wet, phlegm cold and wet, yellow bile hot and dry, and black bile cold and dry. A person's health depended on the balance among these fluids. Too much of one, or too little of another, could cause illness, disease, or even mental disturbance. It wasn't just the body that was thought to be governed by these humours, personality and behaviour were as well. A sanguine person, ruled by blood, was thought to be cheerful and energetic. Someone with excess phlegm might be calm or even lethargic. Yellow bile was associated with anger and ambition, while black bile was linked with melancholy or depression. A healthy individual was one whose humours were in proper proportion and harmony. Illness was simply an imbalance. The job of the physician, then, was to restore equilibrium. When the plague arrived, this model of thinking shaped nearly every response. Doctors and healers believed that the Black Death must be the result of some catastrophic internal disruption. People were vomiting, sweating, bleeding from their mouths and skin, developing terrible swellings, fainting from fever, and dying at shocking speed. Surely, this was the result of the humours being thrown into wild, violent imbalance. Some theorized that the plague was the result of an overabundance of black bile, since so many of the afflicted displayed signs of bodily decay, darkened buboes, and depression. Others blamed too much blood, noting the swellings and the intense fever. Still others pointed to an excess of yellow bile, suggesting that the feverish rage of the illness had a fiery origin. In truth, there was no consensus, and the plague seemed so unnatural, so punishing, that many believed it must have disrupted all 4 humours at once. To correct these imbalances, physicians turned to the methods laid out by Galen and other ancient authorities. They looked at a person's symptoms and tried to deduce which humour was out of order. Was the skin flushed? The body too hot? Then it must be too much blood, best to bleed the patient. Was the patient sweating and lethargic? Maybe there was too much phlegm, time to apply warming agents or induce vomiting. Did the sick person become restless, aggressive, or plagued by hallucinations? Then yellow bile must be to blame. Cooling foods or purgatives were often prescribed. If the person was overcome with despair, tormented by dark thoughts and cold extremities, black bile was thought to be in excess, and the patient would be treated with warming herbs, laxatives, or even emotional stimulation. This system, despite its limitations, offered something profoundly comforting to people: a framework. In a world that seemed to be falling apart, in which death was random, brutal, and invisible, the theory of humours offered an explanation. It provided logic, structure, a way to think about the body that made sense, at least within the boundaries of medieval knowledge. And most importantly, it gave people something to do. If illness was the result of imbalance, then surely balance could be restored. Maybe through food, through bloodletting, through purging or rest or prayer. Maybe it could be prevented. The humoral theory inspired a host of preventative measures that people clung to during plague outbreaks. Diet was regulated carefully, foods were classified according to their humoral effects, and people avoided those that might overheat the body during summer outbreaks, or those that chilled the body too much in colder seasons. People wore protective charms not just against evil, but also against environmental influences that were believed to disrupt humoral harmony. Bad air, foul smells, changes in temperature. Even emotional experiences were thought to influence the humors. Doctors advised plague survivors to avoid strong feelings, grief, anger, lust, all of which could provoke imbalances. People were told to remain calm, keep a peaceful home, avoid excitement, and maintain spiritual equilibrium. In other words, the battle against the plague wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, and even philosophical. But there were limits to this model, and the plague exposed them ruthlessly. Humoral medicine, though deeply rooted in logic and observation, had no answer for the randomness of the plague. It could not account for the way the disease struck down both healthy and frail, rich and poor, pious and sinful. Physicians often died as quickly as their patients. Their carefully written treatises did little to stop the spread. Their mixtures and treatments, however well-intentioned, rarely worked. In many cases, the humoral theory may have worsened the patient's suffering. And yet, the theory endured. It was too central to the way people understood themselves, too deeply entwined with the ancient wisdom that guided education, medicine, and theology. Even as new diseases emerged and old remedies failed, the belief in the humors continued to shape diagnosis and treatment well into the Renaissance and beyond. As we'll soon see, one of the most common treatments designed to rebalance the humors, especially in the case of plague, was the removal of blood. This method, used for centuries, was both symbolic and brutal. It was an attempt to drain away illness, to expel the imbalance. And it was practiced on thousands of plague victims, rich and poor alike. The idea that disease stemmed from an imbalance of bodily fluids was not just a theory, it was the central compass guiding medieval medical practice. And when it came to rebalancing those fluids, no treatment was more widespread, more symbolic, or more grimly ritualistic than bloodletting. Bloodletting was seen as a way to purge the body of excess, particularly the supposed overflow of blood that was believed to be the source of fever, inflammation, and a host of other symptoms. It was a practice that dated back to the ancient world, supported by Galenic texts, and remained deeply embedded in the medical traditions of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. When the Black Death swept across continents, it found a population already accustomed to the idea that blood could carry disease, and that draining it could restore health. During a plague outbreak, this belief took on urgent, often desperate dimensions. If someone developed a fever or swellings, symptoms believed to be tied to a surfeit of blood, the logical course of action was to cut a vein and release it. In towns and cities across Europe, barbers, physicians, and even common healers turned to their lancets and knives. Patients were seated, their arms bound, and a vein, often in the forearm or neck, was opened with a sharp, curved blade. A bowl was placed underneath to collect the blood. The amount to be removed wasn't arbitrary. It was often carefully measured according to manuals or local practice, sometimes adjusted by age and perceived strength of the patient. In more severe cases, they might bleed a person multiple times a day. The sight of blood draining from the body was unsettling, but to the people of the time, it was evidence that the treatment was working. The more blood that came out, the more disease was believed to leave with it. If the blood looked thick or dark, that confirmed to the physician that it had been corrupted. If it was bright and free-flowing, perhaps the worst had passed. Of course, in reality, bloodletting during the plague was almost entirely ineffective, and often dangerous. Many patients were already weakened, dehydrated, and feverish. Removing blood only further destabilized their condition. But the practice was grounded in centuries of belief and continued despite mounting failures. In fact, sometimes the very death of the patient was interpreted as a sign that the disease had been too powerful, not that the treatment itself had hastened it. When knives and scalpels were deemed too invasive or risky, another method was used: leeches. These small, slimy creatures, harvested from rivers and marshes, were natural bloodsuckers, and thus perfect tools for medical bloodletting. Physicians or barbers would place leeches on specific parts of the body, often near the site of a bubo, or on soft areas like behind the ears or along the neck. The leeches would bite into the skin and feed, drawing blood slowly over time. Leeches offered a slower, more controlled method of blood removal, and were sometimes thought to be less traumatic to the patient. They were also used for children, women, and others deemed too delicate for the blade. Some physicians claimed that leeches could detect bad blood, feeding more vigorously in areas of infection. Their use became so widespread that leech collectors, men who gathered them for apothecaries and clinics, became a familiar part of the medical trade. In wealthier cities, jars of leeches were kept in apothecaries and doctors' homes, ready for use. Physicians would sometimes prescribe a regimen, a bleeding session in the morning, followed by herbal tonics or purgatives, then another leeching session in the evening. If the swellings persisted, they would try again the next day. And again. In some cases, the bloodletting wasn't limited to a single location. Physicians might open veins in different parts of the body to try and target specific organs. For instance, they believed that cutting near the ankle could relieve problems in the lower abdomen, or that opening a vein near the temple could treat disorders of the mind. During plague outbreaks, when the infection often localized in painful, swollen lymph nodes, healers tried to draw blood from areas close to these buboes. Some even cut directly into the swellings, hoping that the blood and the disease would flow out together. But this led to more complications, infections, and faster deaths. Despite the dangers, the practice was not limited to licensed physicians. Barbers, who often acted as surgeons, regularly performed bloodletting. In fact, the iconic red and white barber pole is believed to symbolize blood and bandages, the twisted red for blood, the white for cloth. Villagers, herbalists, and midwives also attempted bloodletting when no physician was available. Sometimes people even bled themselves or family members, cutting veins or using hot cups to draw blood to the skin. Interestingly, there was even debate among medieval doctors about whether bloodletting should be used during the plague at all. Some argued it was beneficial, that it could reduce the force of the disease before it overwhelmed the body. Others warned that it might worsen the situation, particularly if done too late or too frequently. Yet, in the absence of better options, many erred on the side of tradition, and took the risk. What bloodletting revealed most of all was the deep belief that the body had to be cleansed of illness from within. The idea that something had poisoned the blood was not far from the truth. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, does indeed travel through the bloodstream in some forms. But without the tools to detect microbes, medieval healers assumed that the solution was to physically remove the offending fluid. It was a brutal logic, a hopeful one, and one that persisted far beyond the plague. 4 centuries afterward, bleeding remained a standard part of medical care. Presidents, kings, peasants, all were bled for ailments ranging from headaches to fevers. It would take the rise of germ theory and modern bacteriology to finally discredit the practice. But during the dark centuries of the plague, when death came knocking at the door with no warning, bloodletting offered something more than cure. It offered the illusion of control. And when even that failed, many turned to other physical treatments, some just as painful and just as desperate. The next of these would involve slicing open the swollen, agonizing buboes that defined the plague's outward symptoms, and applying crude, often grotesque mixtures in an effort to draw the poison out. The buboes, the terrifying hallmark of the bubonic plague, were physical symbols of horror in the 14th century and beyond. They often appeared suddenly and without mercy, tender, swollen lumps erupting under the armpits, on the neck, or in the groin, sometimes growing to the size of an egg or even an apple. Burning hot, black, or purplish in hue, and unbearably painful, these swellings were seen not just as symptoms but as the very seat of the disease. And so, across plague-stricken Europe, many believed that the key to survival lay in attacking these visible signs of sickness head-on. When prayers and potions failed, people turned to their knives. The act of lancing buboes, cutting them open to release the pus, blood, and supposed poisons trapped inside, became one of the most commonly employed treatments. The logic was disturbingly straightforward. If the swelling was where the disease was concentrated, perhaps cutting it would release the infection, much like draining a festering wound. After all, in other fevers or boils, the release of pus often brought relief. So why not here? Physicians and barber surgeons would often begin by carefully examining the buboes, its size, its color, its temperature. When they judged that it had ripened, meaning it was filled with enough fluid to burst or close to bursting on its own, they would make an incision, sometimes using a scalpel, sometimes just a sharp knife. This would be a swift, often unsanitary process. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, and no understanding of the risk of infection. The patient, writhing in agony from the fever and the swelling, would often be held down while the blade opened the skin. What came out was horrific: thick pus, sometimes tinged with blood, sometimes black, greenish, or yellow. The stench was unbearable. Some healers claimed to be able to judge the patient's chances of survival based on the smell or appearance of the discharged fluid. A clean flow was a good sign. Foul-smelling or blackened pus meant death was likely. Once the bubo had been opened, it needed to be treated, or, in medieval thinking, drawn out further. That's where poultices came in. A poultice was a soft, often warm or moist mass of material, herbs, bread, flour, fat, or clay, spread over the wound to help draw out impurities. The idea was that the body could be coaxed into expelling the poison fully if the right substances were applied. Bread soaked in vinegar or wine was a common choice, placed directly on the open sore and wrapped with linen. The acidity of vinegar, though poorly understood, did have mild antiseptic properties, and sometimes slowed the growth of bacteria. In other cases, mixtures of onion, garlic, and butter were used. Garlic, in particular, was seen as a powerful cleanser, often nicknamed the poor man's antibiotic in later centuries. Another popular mixture included crushed herbs like sage, rue, or wormwood, plants associated with purifying properties, and animal fats to help the concoction stick to the skin and soften it. There were more bizarre combinations as well. Some poultices involved dried human feces mixed with rose oil. Others used crushed frogs, or the ashes of burned toads. In some instances, doctors recommended placing a freshly killed pigeon or chicken directly onto the open bubo, believing the life force of the animal would draw out the disease. The animal would often die quickly, either due to its own contact with the infection or simply the trauma, and was then replaced with another, again and again, until the patient either recovered or succumbed. The recipes for poultices varied wildly from region to region and healer to healer. In some monasteries, records survive of poultices made from mulled wine and ash. In French apothecaries, combinations of mustard seeds, wax, and even powdered pearls were used. In Italy, more exotic mixtures appeared, ones that involved balsam, alum, or resin imported from faraway lands. But whether simple or extravagant, each of these was driven by the same belief, that something evil had entered the body and needed to be expelled through the wound. The treatment wasn't limited to one application. Poultices were often applied repeatedly, removed, cleaned, and replaced several times a day. Caretakers and healers would observe the bubo's progress, hoping to see signs of shrinkage or healing. Sometimes the swellings did go down. Sometimes the fever broke. And in those rare cases where the patient survived, it validated the method. No one could say for certain whether it was the lancing, the herbs, or simply luck, but in a world ruled by desperation, even a glimmer of hope was enough. But more often than not, lancing buboes introduced a deadly new threat: infection. With no understanding of antisepsis, healers reused tools without cleaning them. Dirty hands touched open wounds. Cloth wrappings were not always changed. Some patients bled out. Others developed secondary infections like gangrene or tetanus, which rapidly worsened their condition. And yet, in the absence of better options, the practice continued, not just in the 14th century, but for generations afterward, throughout the waves of plague that followed in the 15th, 16th, and even 17th centuries. There's a deeply human truth embedded in this practice. Lancing buboes and applying poultices wasn't just about medical theory. It was about doing something. It was about fighting back. People watched loved ones die in agony, and in the face of that horror, they reached for knives and herbs and ancient remedies not because they fully understood what they were doing, but because doing nothing was worse. The act of cutting, draining, and wrapping gave people a sense of agency. It gave them a role in the drama of life and death. And when even the wounds could not be healed, people turned to stranger, more grotesque, and more symbolic methods of treatment. In their desperation, they would reach for anything, even their own urine, believing that somewhere in the body or the earth, the key to survival might still be found. In an age when medical science was in its infancy and understanding of disease rested on a tangled web of superstition, spiritual fear, and guesswork, nearly every bodily substance, no matter how repulsive, was investigated for its supposed healing properties. And few treatments highlight the desperation of plague-ridden communities more than the use of urine as medicine. Yes, urine. The human body's waste, typically associated with filth and disposal, was repurposed as a tool for survival. To the modern mind, this might sound absurd, revolting even, but in the medieval world, urine had long held a curious place in both diagnosis and healing. Physicians examined its color, smell, and even taste to determine what was wrong with a patient. Elaborate charts compared the hues of urine to various states of imbalance in the humors. It was believed that urine offered a window into the inner workings of the body, revealing the state of the blood, liver, kidneys, and beyond. But this fascination didn't stop at analysis. Over time, and especially during the worst outbreaks of plague, some began to wonder, if urine could reveal the state of disease, could it also be used to treat it? Sage, with its earthy, comforting scent, was another popular remedy. Traditionally associated with wisdom and long life, sage was burned in homes to cleanse the air, steeped in teas to calm fevers, and chewed raw to relieve throat pain. Monks and herbalists believed it could purify the blood, and it often appeared in written plague recipes as a base herb to be combined with others. Sage was sometimes mixed with vinegar and applied to plague sores, or bundled with other herbs and worn around the neck. Rosemary, with its sharp, piney fragrance, was valued both as a medicine and a purifier of spaces. Sprigs of rosemary were burned in sick rooms, tied to belts, or stuffed into beaked plague doctor masks. The herb was used in infusions to rinse the body or to wash linens, and its essential oils, though not fully understood, had mild antimicrobial properties. People boiled rosemary in wine or oil and rubbed the resulting concoction on their chest or temples. It was said to invigorate the heart and protect the breath. Rue, often called herb of grace, had a reputation for warding off poisons and evil spirits. It was a bitter herb, used sparingly in teas or tonics. In times of plague, people hung bunches of rue above their doors or carried it in pouches. Apothecaries sometimes combined it with garlic, wormwood, and vinegar to make plague washes or compresses. It was not just seen as a medicine for the body but as a spiritual shield, one that could turn aside death itself. Wormwood, with its silvery leaves and bitter taste, was another favorite. It was thought to stimulate digestion and expel internal worms or corrupt substances. In plague remedies, wormwood was often combined with wine or brandy, believed to drive the disease from the stomach and intestines. Its fumes were also inhaled to purify the lungs. When mixed with honey, it was used as a soothing throat syrup. Lavender, known for its calming scent, was also part of the plague-fighting arsenal. Lavender flowers were sewn into sachets, worn in pockets, or scattered across floors. They were believed to calm the spirit, ease panic, and purify the air. In some recipes, lavender was steeped in wine or vinegar and used as a skin wash. It was also burned in the belief that its fragrant smoke could cleanse contaminated air. Thyme, a symbol of courage since ancient times, was used both in cooking and healing. People made teas with thyme to soothe coughing, chest pains, or fever. The herb was also stuffed into pillows or burned at night to protect against the breath of the sick. It was commonly included in salves and poultices due to its strong scent and presumed ability to cut through the humors. Mint, often used to freshen breath or calm stomachs, found its way into many plague-era mixtures. It was chewed raw, brewed into tea, or crushed into cold compresses. People believed that mint could revive the spirit, settle the bile, and clear the mind, essential when fear itself was sometimes more overwhelming than the illness. Yarrow, marjoram, anise, and fennel were also staples in the plague-time herb cabinet. Yarrow was used to stop bleeding and close wounds. Marjoram was believed to warm the body and fend off chills. Anise helped with breathing and was added to cough syrups. Fennel, thought to clear the eyes and stomach, was eaten raw or brewed into bitter, medicinal drinks. But beyond individual herbs, it was the combinations that were most commonly used. Herbalists created complex potions, syrups, and salves, sometimes based on written plague recipes handed down for generations. These mixtures often had poetic or mysterious names: Four Thieves Vinegar, Dragon's Breath Oil, the Queen's Balm, or Holy Mother's Elixir. Each was a carefully guarded recipe, a blend of bitter roots, fragrant blossoms, and fiery spices meant to strengthen the body or cleanse the soul. The preparation of these remedies could be ritualistic. Herbs were gathered at specific times, during a full moon, or at dawn, or only from a holy site. Some were dried and powdered, others crushed fresh and mixed with oils, vinegar, honey, or wine. The final products were stored in glass jars or ceramic pots, sometimes wrapped in cloth or sealed with wax. These herbal concoctions weren't just medicinal, they were deeply spiritual. Each blend carried centuries of belief, trust, and accumulated experience. And though most of them had little true effect against the plague bacteria, some may have provided relief, easing pain, clearing sinuses, soothing the chest, or calming a fever. Others helped in subtler ways, giving the sick and their caretakers a sense of control, a feeling that they could fight back, even if the enemy was invisible. For the poor who couldn't afford doctors, or the isolated who had no access to churches or markets, herbs became their entire defense. A single sprig of rosemary, a clove of garlic, a handful of sage, these were not just plants. They were hope. They were shields. They were the last line between life and the abyss. And when people feared that the air itself was poison, these herbs would not only be consumed, they would be burned, carried, and inhaled in desperate efforts to cleanse their surroundings and hold back the invisible tide. In the medieval mind, one of the most deeply rooted explanations for the plague's wrath was the idea of miasma, the belief that disease was spread through noxious or corrupted air. This concept wasn't mere superstition in their eyes. It was science, backed by the best medical knowledge of the time. Doctors, priests, city leaders, all believed that foul-smelling air carried invisible poisons that could seep into the body through the nose and mouth, infecting the lungs and blood. And so, one of the most widespread and ritualistic responses to the plague became the battle to purify the air. In a world with no antibiotics and no real understanding of bacteria, people lit fires, burned herbs, waved censers, and carried pungent pouches on their person, hoping to cleanse the very breath they drew. The burning of herbs and incense was central to this strategy. In homes, streets, sick rooms, and public buildings, smoke became a common tool of defense. People set smudge fires in hearths, at doorways, and even in the middle of rooms where plague victims lay. They burned bundles of juniper, pine, cedar, and bay leaves, plants believed to have purifying and protective properties. The idea was not just to mask foul smells, but to actively drive away the disease itself, which was believed to dwell in the corrupted stench of death, rot, sewage, and unclean bodies. Among the most commonly burned substances was frankincense, a sweet resin long used in religious ceremonies and regarded as spiritually potent. In churches, priests would swing thuribles, hanging incense burners filled with smoking coals and sacred resins, walking up and down the aisles, swinging the thick scent through the air as chants echoed through the nave. This wasn't just for symbolic cleansing, it was a genuine attempt to make the air safer, both physically and spiritually. In homes, those who could afford it would purchase sticks or chunks of frankincense from apothecaries, lighting them with trembling fingers as the plague claimed another neighbor. Myrrh was another prized resin, often used alongside frankincense. It had a sharper, earthier aroma and was believed to ward off evil spirits as well as disease. In sick rooms, it was burned near the bed or mixed with herbs into pastes to be smeared on walls or under the nose. In some places, mixtures of frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and cloves were combined and burned together in ornate copper or brass censers, producing an aromatic fog that filled the room with spicy, sacred warmth. But even the poorest tried to defend themselves with what they had. Dried rosemary, sage, and thyme were burned in clay pots or thrown directly onto hearth fires. The smoke would rise in curling trails, curling around beams and rafters, the smell mingling with fear and prayers. In the countryside, peasants might burn manure, vine clippings, or resinous bark, believing the thick, eye-watering smoke could purify the air by sheer force. This was sometimes done in streets where the smell of decay was overwhelming, an effort to cleanse whole neighborhoods with smoke and heat. In hospitals and plague houses, the practice of fumigation took on more elaborate forms. Workers and attendants, fearing for their own lives, would douse coals with vinegar, sulfur, or even pitch and tar, producing choking, acrid smoke intended to disinfect. These fumes were meant to be so noxious that they would kill the poison in the air. Sometimes patients were placed in a room filled with smoke and told to inhale deeply, in the hope it would counteract the disease already inside them. At other times, entire rooms were sealed and then saturated with smoldering herbs and sulfur for hours at a time, turning the space into a foggy chamber of cleansing. But not all purification involved fire. People also carried scents with them, especially when venturing into public spaces. This took many forms, from simple nosegays to elaborate pomanders, metal spheres or carved wooden beads filled with aromatic compounds. These were carried in hand, worn on a chain, or held to the nose when passing through crowded streets. Some were simple cloth bags filled with dried lavender, mint, or rose petals. Others were intricately crafted balls containing layers of ambergris, musk, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon, soaked in vinegar or pressed into wax. Wealthier citizens might wear perfumed gloves, douse their handkerchiefs with floral oils, or carry ornate boxes filled with dried citrus peels and crushed spices. Perfumed vinegar, known as aromatic vinegar or vinaigre des quatre voleurs, was used not only as a topical treatment but also to scent one's personal space, dabbed under the nostrils or sprinkled on clothing. These portable fortresses of fragrance gave people a fragile sense of protection, a scented barrier between themselves and the creeping breath of death. Children were sometimes sent out with sprigs of marjoram, basil, or lemon balm tucked into their collars. Pregnant women were advised to wear garlands of sweet herbs, and travelers carried bundles of dried plants tied with ribbon. In cities, it was not unusual for plague watchers, guards, or even gravediggers to carry burning torches or incense sticks while on duty, not for light, but for self-defense. The scent of survival even extended into art and ritual. In some ceremonies, the burning of herbs was accompanied by prayers or chants, with participants walking in circles or swinging censers toward each compass direction. Some believed that disease entered from the east with the rising sun and could be expelled toward the setting west. Others performed incantations or blessings while the smoke rose, hoping that the combined power of herb and word would banish the darkness. Looking back, we now know that smoke and scent did little to stop the transmission of plague, which was largely spread by fleas on rats and, in some forms, through droplets from person to person. But in a time without microscopes or medicine, this was not foolishness, it was logic, shaped by centuries of inherited knowledge. The plague smelled like rot and despair, so the response was to make the air sweet, sacred, and holy. And sometimes, perhaps, the belief that it worked was enough. Enough to give comfort. Enough to give hope. In those shadowed times, the curling wisp of rosemary smoke or the soothing balm of lavender under the nose was more than just fragrance. It was a breath of strength, a moment of resistance, a whispered promise that life could still be beautiful, even when surrounded by death. As the plague raged across cities and countrysides, sweeping entire communities into silence and leaving behind only the sound of weeping and bells tolling the dead, desperation began to force the living into difficult and sometimes brutal measures. When it became clear that individual prayers and sweet-smelling herbs were not enough to stop the tide of illness, authorities began to experiment with control through separation. It was not yet a world of germ theory, but some patterns were becoming tragically evident. Those who had contact with the sick often fell ill themselves, and communities untouched by outside travelers sometimes remained miraculously plague-free. From these observations, one of the most important and long-lasting public health responses in history was born: quarantine and lockdown. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40. This was not a random number. In Venice, a major hub of Mediterranean trade and one of the first cities to institutionalize plague control, it became law in the 14th century that incoming ships must anchor off the coast for 40 days before anyone could disembark. This period, inspired in part by biblical references to purification, such as the 40 days of rain in the story of Noah's Ark or Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, was thought to be long enough for any signs of the plague to emerge. If no one aboard fell ill, the ship was deemed safe. If they did, the entire vessel might be burned, its cargo discarded or destroyed. This Venetian system soon spread across Europe. In port cities from Marseille to Dubrovnik, officials began to construct isolated stations known as lazarettos, plague hospitals, or quarantine islands where the sick or possibly infected could be held away from the general population. These were often located outside the city walls, in remote locations, and guarded by armed men. Some lazarettos were converted monasteries, while others were purpose-built with thick stone walls and barred windows, places that were part hospital, part prison. The people sent there were not always infected but merely suspected of exposure. It was a cruel necessity, as even a single plague carrier slipping through the gates of a city could bring unimaginable catastrophe. Inside cities, quarantine took a different form. Lockdowns, though not called that at the time, were imposed in various ways. Sometimes, Entire districts or neighborhoods were cordoned off if a case of plague was discovered. Barricades might be thrown up overnight, made of wood, stone, or whatever could be found. In other cases, infected households were sealed from the outside. Officials, often known as plague wardens, would hammer boards across the doors and post painted symbols to warn others. In London, a red cross was painted on the door, along with the infamous words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." This was more than a warning. It was a death sentence for some. Families locked inside with a sick member might find themselves with no escape as one by one, every member fell ill. Sometimes, neighbors would leave food outside the door. Sometimes, no one came at all. In wealthier parts of town, people tried to flee before such measures could be enforced. But escape was not always possible. Cities enacted travel bans, closing gates and forbidding people from entering or leaving without special permission. Markets were shut down, churches closed, schools dismissed. Soldiers or city guards patrolled the entrances and stood at bridges, armed with halberds or muskets. Letters and goods from other regions were burned or fumigated before being allowed through. These were some of the earliest forms of containment zones, though the term wouldn't be used for centuries. In many towns, a bell would ring whenever a new case was discovered. This was both a warning and a grim announcement that another door would soon be nailed shut. Streets grew quiet, save for the groaning of the sick and the hammering of nails. Windows were shuttered, shutters barred. Only the boldest, or most desperate, dared to move about. Of course, enforcement varied wildly depending on location, leadership, and resources. In some places, local governments were strong enough to enforce strict quarantine laws. In others, chaos and panic reigned. There were uprisings, especially when people felt the quarantines were unjust. Angry citizens sometimes tore down barricades or fought the guards, accusing officials of abandoning them to die. In cities where the plague burned hottest, the rule of law often broke down altogether. But in places where quarantine and lockdown were enforced successfully, the results could be dramatic. Records from certain towns and islands show that strict isolation sometimes spared entire populations. Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, for instance, famously imposed a 30-day quarantine in the 14th century that evolved into one of the earliest fully institutionalized public health systems in the world. Other towns would emulate this, especially during later waves of plague in the 16th and 17th centuries, refining their isolation procedures over time. Interestingly, even travel documents and health passports were born during this era. Travelers, merchants, and sailors began to carry certificates, signed by city officials, declaring them to be from a plague-free zone. These early versions of clean bills of health became essential for moving between cities, and woe to those caught traveling without one. But while the measures were sometimes effective, they were also deeply traumatizing. Families ripped apart, sick people dying in isolation, the poor locked up while the rich fled to country estates. There was little justice in how quarantine was administered. Often, the sickest neighborhoods, usually the poorest, were abandoned altogether, walled off with no supplies, no medicine, no care. In some cases, the people left behind would torch the barricades in protest or simply die quietly, their bodies later collected by teams of plague workers under cover of night. Still, for all its cruelty, quarantine changed the world. It represented a shift from purely spiritual to physical approaches in public health. While people continued to pray and wear charms, they also began to believe that disease could be controlled by human action, by boundaries, by separation, by rules. It was, in many ways, the birth of epidemiology. And even if it was based on flawed understanding, it proved that isolation could slow a pandemic. In time, quarantine became more sophisticated, with protocols, records, and inspections. But during the worst years of the plague, it was often just planks, guards, and fear. And behind each nailed door, behind each sealed gate, was a story, a child begging to be let out, a mother tending to the dying, a man watching his neighbors disappear one by one. A city held its breath. And the world learned, painfully, how to draw lines between the living and the dead. In the dim candlelit corners of plague-ridden Europe, as death stalked every alley and shadows whispered of contagion, people clung desperately to any substance that offered even a flicker of protection. Vinegar, sharp and biting on the tongue, sour in the air, emerged as one of the most widely used and enduring treatments. Unlike the elaborate elixirs crafted by apothecaries or the mystical charms worn around the neck, vinegar was cheap, accessible, and, most importantly, believed to possess strong cleansing properties. Its use became a staple in both the homes of the desperate and the protocols of plague officials. Long before scientists would understand bacteria or viruses, people believed that vinegar's acrid nature could counteract the invisible poisons thought to linger in the air or cling to the skin and surfaces. These invisible dangers were typically referred to as miasma, corrupted air filled with deathly vapors. To combat this unseen menace, vinegar became a kind of homemade disinfectant, and its uses were as varied as the fear that fueled them. People washed their hands, faces, and exposed skin with vinegar multiple times a day. In some places, it became common practice for anyone entering a home, especially physicians, plague watchers, or those delivering goods, to be required to dip their hands in a basin of vinegar before being allowed to proceed. Street vendors, food handlers, and public servants would sometimes carry small flasks of it tied to their belts, dabbing it onto cloths or rubbing it between their palms. In an age where soap was not universally available or trusted, vinegar was often the closest thing people had to a cleansing agent. Beyond personal hygiene, vinegar was used aggressively to sanitize homes and belongings. Tables, chairs, doorknobs, and even floors were scrubbed with vinegar-soaked rags. In wealthier homes, servants might be instructed to wipe down entire rooms daily with strong solutions of wine vinegar, especially if someone nearby had fallen ill. The scent became as common as the tolling of funeral bells, clinging to the air in every dwelling that had survived the first sweep of the sickness. City officials began to incorporate vinegar into public health mandates. In some towns, it was used in plague hospitals to clean bedding and utensils. Attendants caring for the sick would be required to wash their hands and tools between visits to different patients using vinegar, sometimes mixed with water, sometimes applied undiluted. Spoons and cups used by the ill were rinsed in vinegar before being handled by anyone else, although this practice was far from standardized. There are also records of vinegar being used in more imaginative ways. People would soak coins in vinegar before giving or receiving them in an attempt to disinfect money, one of the most commonly exchanged objects and thus a likely vector for disease, in their eyes. In some cities, visitors from plague-affected regions were made to pass through a cleansing station where their clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were washed or wiped down with vinegar before they were allowed entry. Certain shops even advertised vinegar fumigations, or sold pre-soaked cloths for people to place over their mouths and noses. The belief in vinegar's power extended into rituals and superstitions as well. In churches, when congregations still dared to gather, it wasn't uncommon to see basins of vinegar placed at the entrances. Worshippers might dip their fingers in and trace a cross on their foreheads, combining purification with prayer. Processions that marched through towns in supplication sometimes carried vinegar-soaked cloths on poles, swinging them in the air to purify the path ahead. Travelers during plague times would sometimes carry small vinegar sponges inside metal containers or wooden amulets. These were held to the nose when walking through infected areas, much like the scented herbs in the plague doctor's mask. The vinegar fumes were thought to counteract the corrupt air and keep the lungs clean. Not surprisingly, vinegar also found its way into medicinal mixtures. Some home remedies called for mixing vinegar with garlic or onions and drinking the mixture to purge the body of internal toxins. Others recommended vinegar compresses for fevered foreheads or vinegar baths to draw out the heat. Even the infected buboes, those swollen, painful lumps that appeared in the armpits and groin, were sometimes lanced and then treated with vinegar-soaked cloths, though this practice was both excruciating and, more often than not, ineffective. While vinegar's actual antiseptic properties were minor by modern standards, it was one of the few treatments that may have had some genuine benefit. Acetic acid, found in vinegar, does have mild antimicrobial qualities. In a time without antibiotics or antiseptic soaps, even a small reduction in surface bacteria could have helped slow the spread of infection, though it could do little against the fleas and rats that were truly spreading the disease. Yet for those trapped inside plague houses, sealed away behind marked doors, vinegar often symbolized their last hope. They would pour it onto cloths to breathe through, hoping to cleanse the air. They would soak their only coins in it, praying the merchant at the door would accept the payment. They would wash the body of a sick child with it, fighting the fever inch by inch, drop by sour-smelling drop. Over time, vinegar became almost sacred in its association with health and protection. When other cures failed, when leeches bled the weak dry, when charms failed to protect the faithful, when prayers went unanswered, vinegar remained. It was something the people could use themselves, without priests or physicians. It was harsh but familiar, and its sting on the skin at least felt like action, like resistance. In this way, vinegar was more than a substance. It was a ritual, a comfort, a shield against despair. And even as plague returned again and again, generation after generation, the scent of vinegar would linger in the cracks of the stone walls and in the memories of survivors, bitter, burning, and defiant. In the throes of medieval and early modern pandemics, when prayers failed and the pestilence showed no mercy, people turned to ever more desperate and dangerous measures in a last-ditch attempt to rid their homes, and even their bodies, of plague. Among the most extreme and alarming methods was fumigation, the practice of purifying air and space through the use of choking, noxious fumes. It was a brutal approach to what people believed was a spiritual or atmospheric disease. If miasmas, the invisible clouds of corrupted air, were what poisoned the lungs and brought about the plague, then perhaps one could drive them out by fire, smoke, or chemical fury. The most notorious substances used in this terrifying ritual were sulfur and mercury, both known even then to be unpleasant and dangerous, though the full extent of their toxicity wouldn't be understood for centuries. Nevertheless, belief in their power as purifiers persisted through every wave of plague. These were not casual treatments, they were invasions, chemical assaults on both spaces and the people trapped within them. Sulfur, sometimes called brimstone, had long held a place in religious and folkloric traditions. It was associated with hellfire and divine wrath, with cleansing by flame, and was thought to repel demons, devils, and corrupt influences. To medieval minds, it was only logical that sulfur might also purge plague from a home or ward. As the Black Death swept through Europe, sulfur was burned in homes, inns, churches, and hospitals. The yellowish crystals would be placed on hot coals or thrown directly into hearths, releasing a suffocating cloud of sulfur dioxide that burned the eyes and throat and turned the air acrid. Windows would be sealed, doors bolted shut, and the fumes left to linger for hours. Sometimes the house was abandoned during the process, the family driven into the cold as the pestilent air was boiled out. Other times, especially in plague hospitals, the sick were left inside during fumigation, their rooms thick with gas, their lungs already damaged from infection struggling against this new poison. There are reports of patients coughing violently, gasping for breath, or fainting during these treatments. In rare cases, people died, not from the plague, but from the fumes meant to save them. Still, the practice was widespread. Sulfur was inexpensive and relatively easy to obtain. Towns would distribute it to residents, encouraging them to burn it daily as a preventative measure. Physicians recommended it as a spiritual smoke that chased out corruption. In some cities, carts filled with burning sulfur were pulled through streets to fumigate entire neighborhoods, a rolling cloud of choking smoke that followed in their wake. In other cases, sulfur was burned in public buildings or at city gates, as if to cleanse the very air entering the town. If sulfur was seen as a way to scourge evil spirits from a space, mercury was something darker and more ambitious, used not only to cleanse rooms but also to treat the body itself, especially in desperate efforts to save those already infected. Mercury, known then as quicksilver, was considered a powerful agent capable of driving disease from the body due to its corrosive, penetrating nature. It was more commonly associated with the treatment of syphilis in the early modern period, but during outbreaks of plague, some practitioners experimented with exposing patients to mercurial fumes, believing it could sweat the infection out or destroy it within. One method involved heating mercury in a sealed room, often mixed with other substances, and forcing the patient to breathe the vapor while bundled in heavy blankets. The fumes would enter the lungs, irritate the throat, cause intense sweating, and sometimes induce vomiting or hallucinations. These treatments were extremely dangerous. Mercury is one of the most toxic elements known to man, and prolonged exposure to its vapors causes severe damage to the nervous system, kidneys, and brain. Victims of this method often showed signs of mercury poisoning, tremors, tooth loss, skin eruptions, memory loss, and eventually madness. But in the minds of many, such risks were justified if they could spare someone from the far more immediate death that the plague promised. Sometimes, fumigation rituals combined multiple ingredients: sulfur, arsenic, mercury, pitch, turpentine, and resins, a cauldron of toxic smoke. These were burned in braziers and incense pots, in hallways and chambers, with the hope that the combined chemical power might create a barrier that the plague could not cross. People believed these substances could kill the invisible agents of disease in the air, whether they imagined them as demons, miasmas, or poisonous seeds. There were even state-sanctioned fumigations. During the Italian plague of 1629 to 1631, officials in Milan and Venice authorized regular fumigations of public buildings, particularly lazarettos and places where plague victims had died. Some cities had plague fumigation officers or workers assigned to carry out smoke treatments across infected quarters, filling rooms with an eye-watering miasma of chemical despair. These workers often wore masks or scarves soaked in vinegar to protect themselves from both disease and the fumes they unleashed. In rural areas, people turned to similar practices on a smaller scale. Barns, cottages, and cellars were fumigated with burning herbs mixed with sulfur. Animal carcasses were burned with sulfur in the belief that they, too, carried the infection. Fires were sometimes kept burning day and night, not for warmth, but to ensure that clean, hot air pushed back against the cold, moist vapors believed to spread the plague. And yet, even as people coughed and choked in the name of health, the plague continued its grim march. Fumigation might have had some minor benefit by deterring fleas or disrupting rodent habitats, but it was largely ineffective against the root cause of the disease, Yersinia pestis, spread by flea bites and infected respiratory droplets. What's more, the very chemicals people used to cleanse the air were often more harmful than helpful, poisoning the lungs, irritating the skin, and creating an environment of constant fear. Despite this, fumigation remained in use for centuries, persisting into the 18th century and beyond. It was, in part, a ritual, a way to assert some control in a world unraveling at the seams. The thick clouds of sulfur and mercury, foul as they were, gave people a sense of action, of fighting back. They may not have known what the plague truly was, but they would not go down without a struggle. Inside smoke-choked homes, among coughing children and fevered grandparents, people lit the flames and prayed the smoke would save them. They sealed their windows, held cloths to their faces, and watched the room fill with haze. And through the smoke, they stared at death, hoping it would pass them by. Among the most iconic and haunting images to emerge from the plague years is that of the plague doctor. A figure shrouded in black, face hidden behind a strange bird-like mask, eyes obscured by glass lenses, moving slowly through streets thick with death. Today, the plague doctor costume has become a symbol of medieval medical practices, often mistaken for something purely theatrical or macabre. But at the time, this unusual outfit was a genuine and serious attempt to create a barrier between the living and the dying, between those who treated disease and those it devoured. The costume, often misunderstood, was not universally worn during every plague outbreak. It is most commonly associated with the 17th century, especially in cities like Rome, Venice, and Paris, where plague continued to surge in waves long after the initial devastation of the Black Death in the 14th century. Designed as a form of early protective gear, it combined superstition, flawed medical theory, and an embryonic understanding of contagion into one of the first purpose-built outfits meant to shield a physician from infection. At the heart of the plague doctor costume was the beaked mask, a long and curved piece of hardened leather or waxed cloth resembling the beak of a bird. This was not a whimsical design, but a functional one, based on the now-debunked theory of miasma, or bad air. The belief was that plague was spread not by germs or direct contact, but by corrupted air, full of invisible poisons that entered the body through the nose. To combat this, doctors stuffed the hollow beak with a potent mixture of aromatic substances, herbs, spices, dried flowers, and resins believed to cleanse the air before it reached the lungs. Each physician had their own favored mixture, but common ingredients included lavender, rosemary, myrrh, mint, cloves, cinnamon, rose petals, camphor, and even vinegar-soaked sponges. In some versions, the beak was perforated near the nostrils to allow scented air in, filtered through this fragrant protection. To the modern mind, the result looks ghoulish and theatrical, but to those who wore it, it was a last line of defense, both spiritual and physical, against the deadliest disease they knew. The mask covered the entire face and often included glass or crystal lenses over the eyes. These weren't just for disguise, they were meant to keep airborne poisons, or pestilential vapors, from entering through the eyes, which were considered another route for infection. The lenses gave the plague doctor a bug-eyed, alien appearance, heightening the fear and mystery that surrounded them. The rest of the outfit was designed with a similar goal in mind: total bodily coverage. Plague doctors wore long coats or robes, usually made of wax canvas, leather, or oilcloth, materials chosen for their ability to repel moisture and, hopefully, disease. The coat extended from the neck all the way to the feet and was often sealed at the wrists and ankles. Underneath, the doctor might wear additional layers of linen or wool to further insulate themselves from the air and touch of the infected. The costume included gloves, also made from leather or thick cloth, and boots that were tall and tucked beneath the gown. Everything was designed to be easily washed, typically with vinegar or aromatic solutions, or, in extreme cases, burned after use. A wide-brimmed hat, often made of leather, crowned the ensemble. This wasn't merely a fashion statement but a symbol of the medical profession and an extra protective layer shielding the head from droplets or dust. The outfit was both armor and advertisement. It signaled the presence of medical authority while striking fear into the hearts of plague-stricken citizens. Children would weep at the sight of the beaked figures, and adults sometimes avoided them out of fear that death itself followed in their wake. The presence of a plague doctor meant that the household had fallen ill, and that the community would soon take steps to isolate, cleanse, or abandon the property. Many plague doctors also carried a staff or cane, usually about 3 to 4 feet long. This tool served multiple purposes. They could use it to examine patients at a distance, point to things without touching them, or poke at clothing and bedding to inspect or move it. In more aggressive uses, the cane served to ward off desperate people, enforce quarantine measures, or fend off stray animals. It was an extension of their authority and a buffer between themselves and the world of the infected. Despite their menacing appearance, plague doctors were not always trained physicians. In many cases, especially during particularly severe outbreaks, cities would hire anyone willing to take the risk. Barbers, apothecaries, even common laborists, outfitting them with the costume and sending them out to record deaths, examine patients, and offer rudimentary care. They were part bureaucrat, part undertaker, and part physician. Their duties varied from city to city, but they typically involved documenting plague cases, treating the ill, if only symptomatically, performing autopsies, and sometimes even testifying in court regarding the deaths they had witnessed. Some were paid handsomely, with promises of bonuses or pensions for their families if they died in service. Others were poorly compensated, seen as expendable or necessary evils in a time of desperate need. The irony of the plague doctor outfit is that, while it provided a psychological sense of protection, it offered little real defense against the mechanisms of the plague. The cloth and leather could not block fleas, and the aromatic beak could not filter out bacteria. Nevertheless, there is some speculation that the full body coverage did inadvertently help prevent some cases of direct contact transmission, especially if the doctor avoided touching patients with bare hands. Still, many plague doctors fell ill and died alongside the patients they were meant to help. The costume was not magic, nor was it science, but it was a powerful statement. It revealed the terrifying blend of hope, fear, and ignorance that defined an era of plague. People did not understand how the disease worked, but they tried to fight it with whatever tools they could fashion, from prayers to potions, from masks to smoke. The beaked mask, now replicated in costumes and cartoons, once walked the streets in silence, gliding past homes draped in death, stepping cautiously over cobblestones soaked in fear. It bore witness to suffering, to resilience, to humanity's refusal to give up even in the face of apocalyptic devastation. The plague doctor was a symbol of dread, but also of effort. Of a society trying, in its own broken way, to save itself. In an age where the true cause of the plague remained an unfathomable mystery, people grasped for answers and remedies wherever they could find them. In the heavens, in the scriptures, and even in the animal world. Among the more peculiar and desperate practices of plague medicine was the use of animals and animal-derived substances as treatments. These weren't just based on random superstition, they were often rooted in the dominant medical philosophies of the time, particularly the theory of sympathetic magic and the idea of transference, that disease could be transferred from a sick human body into another object or being, which would then carry the illness away. One of the strangest and most notorious animal-based cures involved the use of live chickens, particularly plucked hens or roosters. Physicians and folk healers alike believed that placing a live chicken, specifically the bare chest or rump, against the inflamed, swollen buboes of a plague victim could draw out the disease. This method, documented in multiple plague treatises, called for the chicken to be completely plucked on its underside, then strapped or pressed firmly against the patient's lymphatic swellings, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. The rationale behind this grotesque therapy was that the chicken, being a warm and living creature, could absorb the poison or imbalance from the human body. The animal's vitality, it was thought, would naturally attract the illness, like iron to a magnet, and hold it in place of the person. Often, this was not a one-time application. The chicken would remain pressed against the bubo until it either died or showed signs of illness, at which point it would be replaced with another bird. A cycle of substitution would continue until either the patient improved or perished. Sometimes, several chickens would be sacrificed in this morbid process, and the dead birds were discarded as though they had physically absorbed the plague. But chickens weren't the only animals recruited in humanity's flailing war against the Black Death. Other methods included the use of toads, particularly large ones that were believed to possess natural absorptive powers. A toad might be cut open, its belly split to expose its organs, and then it would be placed directly onto the infected skin. As with the chicken, the belief was that the toad could act as a sponge for pestilence, sucking out the poisonous humors or miasmas from the body. If the toad died or became bloated, interpreted as a sign it had taken on the disease, another would be used in its place. Some practitioners even crushed the toad and mixed its body with herbs to create a poultice or ointment. Another strange and distressing practice was the application of animal fat or dung. Recipes for plague salves sometimes called for goose fat, pigeon droppings, or even human excrement, all to be mixed with spices or vinegar and applied to the skin. While some ingredients had minor antibacterial effects, most did little to alleviate symptoms and were more likely to introduce secondary infections or increase suffering. Even animal bones or powdered antlers were sometimes used in concoctions designed to balance humors or drive away evil forces. In extreme cases, people turned to even more obscure animal-based concoctions. In some rural areas, bloodletting was combined with animal rubbings, in which freshly butchered animal parts were rubbed over the patient's skin in hopes that the life force of the recently deceased creature might invigorate the ailing human. Some believed in using rabbit skins, dog saliva, or donkey milk, the latter consumed as a tonic thought to calm fevers and purify the blood. In urban areas where animals were not always readily available, dried and powdered animal parts, including horn, liver, heart, or gallbladder, were traded by apothecaries or healers as ingredients for more refined remedies. These powders were added to herbal mixtures or swallowed in capsules of parchment or wax. Some recipes even combined parts from multiple animals, such as snakes and frogs, believing that the variety of creatures increased the mixture's potency. Symbolism often played a role as well. The use of snakes, for instance, drew on their biblical and mythological associations with both death and healing. Some mixtures included the dried skin or venom of serpents, crushed and steeped in oil or alcohol. The dual symbolism, death and regeneration, gave these ingredients an air of supernatural power. There were also cures based on astrological animals assigned specific properties by celestial interpretations. If the stars dictated that a person was under the influence of Saturn, for example, a healer might recommend the use of a particular animal thought to counteract that planetary influence, again revealing how medicine, superstition, and astrology all coalesced into a single desperate strategy for survival. And behind these practices lay the deep, primal belief that disease was a living entity, a spirit or poison that could be passed, traded, or coaxed from one body into another. The animals became vessels, unwilling, often tortured participants in a drama where human life hung in the balance. Their suffering was seen as both necessary and redemptive, a physical sacrifice meant to spare the dying. To modern minds, these treatments are disturbing. They seem cruel, ineffective, and absurd. Yet in a time of unimaginable fear, with no microscopes, no antibiotics, and no knowledge of bacteria, they were also logical, even caring acts. People tried what they could, borrowing from the world around them, flora, fauna, and flesh, in an attempt to hold back the tide of death. The use of animals in plague medicine is a window into how people interpreted disease. Not just as a clinical event, but as something alive, something that could be reasoned with, transferred, tamed, or expelled, if only they could find the right vessel, the right ritual, or the right sacrifice. In an age when fear of the plague loomed as large as the disease itself, and where understanding of its origin was obscured by mysticism, religion, and pseudoscience, people turned not only to medical treatments but to objects of power, amulets, talismans, and magic charms, as a way of shielding themselves from the invisible, ever-present threat of death. These objects weren't simply decorative, They were believed to be potent tools, sometimes the last hope, in a person's attempt to survive an illness that no one could predict, prevent, or cure. To truly understand why amulets and charms were so widely used during the plague, one must grasp the worldview of the medieval and early modern periods. At that time, the boundaries between science, religion, and magic were porous. Disease was not just seen as a physical affliction, it was also spiritual, celestial, or demonic in nature. The plague, therefore, was not only something to be treated with herbs and leeches, but also something to be fought with spiritual armor. One of the most common forms of protection came in the shape of religious items. People wore small crosses around their necks, often carved from wood or made of inexpensive metal. Many carried relics, small bones or cloth pieces associated with saints, wrapped in cloth pouches and kept close to the body. Some believed that merely being near a holy object could ward off illness, especially if the relic had belonged to a saint known for healing or protection. The Virgin Mary, in particular, was often invoked through medallions and images, her purity seen as a counterforce to the corruption of disease. Another widely used item was the scapula, a type of religious garment or token, usually composed of two small pieces of cloth connected by strings and worn over the shoulders. These were often inscribed with sacred texts or blessed by clergy. Some were specifically believed to protect against sudden death or pestilence, with inscriptions like "Protect me from sudden death, O Lord," or "In this sign, you shall conquer." They were tokens not only of faith but of spiritual bargaining, pleading for mercy from divine forces. But it wasn't only the sacred that people turned to. Gemstones and crystals, believed to possess intrinsic magical and healing properties, were also widely worn or carried. For example, amber was thought to purify the air around the wearer and absorb disease. It was common to see amber beads around the necks of the wealthy, particularly during outbreaks. Sapphires were prized for their supposed ability to repel poison and infection. Topaz was believed to draw out harmful humors from the body, while emeralds were said to strengthen the heart and immune system. These stones were not just worn as jewelry, they were often engraved with symbols or Latin phrases meant to activate their protective powers. Some people believed that stones changed color in the presence of illness, or that they would crack or shatter when absorbing too much negative energy, thus saving the bearer from harm. Coral, too, was frequently used, particularly red coral, associated with vitality and life force. Parents sometimes placed coral beads around the necks of children in hopes of keeping them safe from the plague. Perhaps most fascinating were the magic charms, objects not sanctioned by the church, but widespread nonetheless. These might be inscribed with protective symbols, astrological signs, or magical words. Some charms contained squares of parchment on which were written magical spells or invocations to angels, folded and sewn into leather pouches or cloth and worn close to the heart. People believed these written charms could repel demons, bad luck, or even the plague itself. One of the most famous magical symbols was the abracadabra triangle, in which the word abracadabra was written repeatedly, each time dropping a letter, forming a triangle that dwindled down to a single A. This symbol, dating back to Roman times, was thought to trap and dispel illness, gradually weakening its grip just as the word itself vanished. People wore it around their necks, pinned it to their clothing, or hung it over the doors of their homes. There were also charms that involved alchemical symbols or planetary alignments, which were thought to protect against the astrological influences believed to cause disease. In this way, people wore planetary metals, like lead for Saturn, iron for Mars, or gold for the Sun, believing that harmonizing with the celestial order could prevent bodily chaos. A wide range of herbal and animal-based amulets were also common. Dried wolf teeth, rabbit feet, or snake skins were carried as tokens of vitality and power. Certain herbs, like wormwood, rue, and sage, were wrapped in cloth and worn as protective packets. These bundles might be placed inside a person's clothing or sewn into the lining of a hat or coat. The idea was that the strong scents and properties of the herbs would either drive away bad air or guard the soul from spiritual contagion. Among children, protective dolls or figurines were sometimes crafted from cloth, clay, or wax. These might represent saints or magical guardians, and were kept near the bed, under pillows, or hung above doors. In some villages, entire families might create household charms together, drawing protective symbols on their door frames, burning special mixtures to charge amulets, or burying small magical tokens in the four corners of their home to ward off the plague. The psychological impact of these objects cannot be overstated. They provided a sense of control in a world where control had vanished. When neighbors were dying, doctors were helpless, and prayers seemed unanswered, a small amulet clutched in the palm or hung around the neck gave people something to hold on to, literally and figuratively. These items became vessels for hope, desperation, and belief. Interestingly, even plague doctors themselves sometimes wore charms inside their beaked masks or robes. Tiny rolls of parchment inscribed with invocations, amulets blessed by priests, or fragments of protective herbs. The line between science and superstition was not always clear, even for those who claimed to be medical professionals. In many ways, the use of amulets and charms shows how the plague era was defined not just by death, but by human resilience, the will to survive, to protect loved ones, to believe in something greater than the darkness closing in. Whether or not these objects truly had any power didn't matter. In the context of the time, they had meaning. And in a world unraveling, meaning was a powerful cure in itself. As the plague ravaged towns and cities, reducing populations to silence, fear, and mourning, people across medieval Europe turned not only to doctors or potions, but to the divine. In fact, for many, prayer and religious devotion were the first, and often the only, lines of defense against the disease. The church stood as both a spiritual sanctuary and a physical space where people gathered in hopes of mercy, forgiveness, and healing. In the eyes of the faithful, the plague was not just a medical disaster, it was a spiritual reckoning, a sign of God's anger or a test of his people's devotion. And thus, prayer became one of the most widely practiced and deeply personal responses to the Black Death. Throughout cities and small villages, church bells rang constantly, not just to announce deaths or funerals, but to call the people to prayer. In times of pestilence, special masses were organized. These were solemn gatherings where entire communities would come together, sometimes at great risk of contagion, to beg God for relief. The prayers at these services were often directed towards saints believed to have power over illness and death. Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows and thought to have survived a terrible plague himself, became a particularly popular figure. His image was painted in churches, hung in homes, and carried in processions. Saint Roch was another favorite. Legend said he had healed plague victims and even survived the disease himself with the help of a loyal dog. In some towns, these special masses were held daily, even multiple times per day, in the belief that persistence in prayer could turn away God's wrath. Priests would lead congregations in litanies, long, repetitive prayers that invoked God's mercy, the protection of the Virgin Mary, and the intercession of the saints. These litanies often went on for hours, and many were composed specifically for use during plague years, with lines like, "From the plague, famine, and war, deliver us, O Lord," repeated by the faithful like a desperate mantra. Sometimes, people engaged in processions through their towns, carrying crucifixes, icons, and banners adorned with religious imagery. These processions were both a show of communal piety and a form of public prayer, where the entire town would walk, sing hymns, and cry out for salvation. Monks and priests carried incense and holy water, hoping to purify the air and the souls of the people. In many cases, these processions were held despite the obvious risk of infection. Crowds only hastened the spread of disease, but the spiritual need felt more urgent than the physical danger. Inside churches, people lit candles by the hundreds, their flickering flames representing the prayers of the living and the hopes of salvation. Families would donate money to the church, sponsor masses for their loved ones, and pay for indulgences, documents that promised the reduction of time in purgatory. The poor who could not afford such offerings knelt just the same, weeping into their hands, whispering prayers to saints and angels, and hoping their voices would rise high enough to be heard above the suffering of the world. Pilgrims flooded the altars, falling to their knees, confessing sins in whispers and sobs. Some would sleep overnight in churches, believing the proximity to relics or sacred images would offer divine protection. Entire families might fast for days or weeks, abstaining from meat, wine, or other pleasures in hopes that their sacrifice would please God. The idea was simple but profound. If the plague was punishment, then repentance might stop it. At home, families created altars in their living spaces, arranging crucifixes, candles, and small icons of saints. They knelt together, praying the rosary, singing hymns, or reading from sacred texts, if they were literate or had access to someone who was. It wasn't uncommon for people to carve their own makeshift crosses out of wood or even bones and keep them close, clutching them like lifelines. In monasteries and nunneries, monks and nuns prayed unceasingly. Many of them died in service to others, tending to the sick, comforting the dying, or burying the dead. They held vigils, all-night prayer gatherings in which the sacred hours were marked by psalms and quiet chants, their voices echoing in the stone halls as disease claimed life after life outside their walls. Some orders, particularly in Italy and France, composed entire books of plague prayers, designed specifically to be said during times of outbreak, with titles such as Prayers Against Sudden Death or Devotions in the Time of Pestilence. There were also more personal and intimate forms of prayer. In the privacy of their own rooms or on the quiet steps of a chapel, individuals might prostrate themselves, lying face down on the floor in a position of total surrender. Others climbed stairs on their knees, whispering prayers at each step, their eyes red with exhaustion and their clothing torn in acts of penitence. Some lashed themselves or wore rough garments made of sackcloth, believing that physical suffering could mirror their spiritual plea for mercy. Among the most fervent acts of faith were vows, in which individuals promised to perform certain acts or undertake specific journeys if they or their loved ones were spared. These vows could include lifelong service to the church, donations of land, or pilgrimages to distant holy sites. Many such promises were written down and kept on altars, offerings of hope in the face of fear. Of course, not all forms of religious service were equal in their effect. Some clergy acted selfishly, fleeing the cities or refusing to administer last rites. But others became true martyrs, remaining with the dying even when they knew it meant their own death. In records from plague-stricken towns, we see again and again the names of priests and monks who died caring for others, some buried in the same mass graves as their congregants. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these religious services was the growing sense of spiritual uncertainty. As the plague returned in waves, sometimes for decades, and the death toll climbed into the tens of millions, some began to wonder if prayer alone was enough. Why was God silent? Why were the innocent suffering? Why did the pious die just as quickly as the sinful? These doubts, whispered in the dark corners of sanctuaries, began to shake the spiritual foundations of Europe. Yet for many, prayer remained the only comfort. Still, the flicker of candles never went out. Even as graves multiplied and families vanished, the survivors returned to their churches. They lit new candles. They said old prayers. They sang familiar hymns with broken voices. They wept. And in those moments, though the plague could not be stopped, people found something that medicine and logic could not give them. A sense of connection to something greater, a sliver of peace amid chaos, and a final hope that they were not, in the eyes of the divine, entirely forgotten. As the plague ravaged cities and the death toll climbed beyond anything Europe had seen before, desperation gave birth to fervent extremes. None more striking than the rise of the flagellants, religious zealots who marched through towns and countrysides whipping themselves in public as a spectacle of repentance and sacrifice. Their bodies became both their altar and their offering, raw and blooded in the hope that their suffering might atone for the sins of all mankind. For many, the plague was more than a disease, it was divine judgment. And if humanity's wickedness had brought this wrath, then only deep, visible penance could hope to reverse it. The flagellant movement emerged most famously during the Black Death of the mid-14th century, though its roots trace back earlier, to moments of social and religious crisis. But during the worst years of the plague, especially between 1348 and 1350, these traveling groups surged across Central and Western Europe. They arrived in towns in long, solemn processions, barefoot, hooded, and draped in rough robes, often in groups of 33, symbolizing the number of years Christ lived on earth. At first, locals greeted them with reverence and awe. Here were people so moved by faith, so anguished by sin, that they chose to take suffering into their own hands, literally. Each day, sometimes multiple times a day, the flagellants would gather in town squares or in front of churches and form circles or long lines. In a tense, ritualized silence, they stripped their upper garments, revealing scarred and already bleeding backs. Then, in a rhythmic motion, they took up whips, often made of leather thongs, some studded with iron spikes, and began to beat themselves. The sound of leather on skin, the dull thud of the lashes, and the growing gasp of pain created a surreal, almost hypnotic atmosphere. Blood would run down their backs and soak into the ground. Spectators watched with awe, horror, or a mix of both. Some cried openly, believing this was what humanity needed, to suffer publicly, brutally, and unrelentingly until God's mercy returned. Each whipping session was part of a carefully choreographed ritual, punctuated by hymns, prayers, and chants. The flagellants believed that by reenacting Christ's passion through their own torment, they could earn divine forgiveness, not just for themselves but for entire communities. Their wounds were not just signs of pain but spiritual offerings, sacrifices meant to persuade God to lift the pestilence. Their rituals would often last for 33.5 days, each day marking a year of Christ's life and culminating in intense communal whipping sessions. These men, and in rare cases, women, eschewed comforts, slept outdoors or in barns, and refused to accept food from certain sources, fearing contamination from the sinful. They rejected the Church's traditional authority, believing that the corruption of the clergy had itself invoked God's anger and helped unleash the plague. In their minds, true spiritual purity had to come from personal suffering, not from indulgences or rituals led by bishops who lived in wealth while peasants died in filth. As they moved from place to place, they stirred up powerful emotions. Some towns welcomed them, hoping that their presence would cleanse the air or show heaven their remorse. Crowds gathered to watch. Markets shut down during the rituals. Children and elders wept. Mothers brought sick infants to the processions, hoping their child might be healed by witnessing the fervor. For a moment, the flagellants offered what few others could, a sense of action, of purpose, and of hope. But not everyone was impressed or reassured. The Church grew wary, particularly the papacy in Avignon, which saw the flagellant movement as increasingly dangerous. They were fanatical, unsupervised, and rapidly growing in popularity. Worst of all, they were openly challenging ecclesiastical authority, preaching that the clergy had failed and that only their extreme piety could fix what was broken. Some flagellant groups even began preaching heretical messages, predicting apocalyptic doom and claiming prophetic insights. By 1349, Pope Clement VI officially condemned the flagellants, issuing edicts to suppress them. He instructed bishops to excommunicate those who participated and forbade them from preaching or performing public rituals. In some towns, local officials began to fear that these groups were inciting unrest. After all, a crowd watching a bloody whipping ritual could easily turn into a mob. Moreover, as the plague did not end, despite the beatings, the prayers, the sacrifices, some began to question the effectiveness of such suffering. The sight of people wounded, infected, and dying from their own lashes, sometimes spreading disease rather than halting it, caused the public mood to shift. What once had looked like divine devotion began to resemble dangerous fanaticism. Still, the movement did not vanish entirely. In later centuries, smaller flagellant groups re-emerged, especially during outbreaks of disease or war. In Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, echoes of the old processions returned during future plagues. Some monks, even within the Church, engaged in private flagellation as an act of discipline or purification. And in folklore, the image of the blooded pilgrim, driven by guilt and fear, remained etched into the cultural memory. The flagellants remind us of a time when faith and fear fused into something physically excruciating and spiritually charged. They are an emblem of the medieval mind in crisis, desperate for redemption, convinced that suffering had meaning, and willing to do whatever it took to earn mercy. Whether misguided or sincere, their processions were testaments to the human need to act, to atone, and to believe that somewhere beyond the blood, beyond the pain, forgiveness, and maybe survival, could still be found. As plague swept across Europe and death became a constant presence in towns and villages, the faithful searched for any source of divine mercy that might offer hope, no matter how distant or miraculous. One of the most widespread and deeply embedded beliefs of the time was that healing could be found not through science or medicine, but through direct contact with the sacred. Pilgrimages, journeys of devotion to holy places, often housing relics, became both acts of faith and desperate bids for survival. The belief that touching or merely being near a sacred object could bring healing or protection was deeply rooted in medieval Christianity, and during times of pestilence, these beliefs surged to new and sometimes frenzied heights. 4 centuries prior to the plague, the veneration of relics had been a central part of Christian life. These relics ranged from the bones of saints to fragments of Christ's cross, from the Virgin Mary's veil to blood-stained shrouds believed to have once covered holy martyrs. Churches and cathedrals across Europe proudly housed these items in ornate reliquaries, boxes of silver, gold, or crystal, displayed like treasures but revered as portals to the divine. Many believed that relics could perform miracles, protect entire towns, and heal the sick. And when the plague came, belief in their power intensified. Pilgrimages often spanned weeks or months. People set out on foot or by cart, alone or in groups, enduring hunger, exposure, and exhaustion to reach a destination where holy relics were kept. The more famous the relic, the greater its supposed power, and therefore the larger the crowds that flocked to it. Shrines like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, believed to house the remains of Saint James the Greater, saw floods of visitors. So did the sanctuary of St. Edmund in Bury St. Edmunds, and the tomb of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. These sites were considered fountains of divine grace. If one were to die en route, many believed they would still be blessed in the afterlife. But during plague years, the nature of these journeys changed. They were no longer just acts of religious devotion, they became urgent appeals for survival. Parents carried sick children for miles in the hope that a saint's intercession might spare them. Entire families uprooted their lives, traveling toward shrines said to offer protection from the pestilence. In many cases, the act of pilgrimage itself was thought to be a penance capable of earning divine forgiveness, which in turn might shield one from illness. These journeys weren't without risk. Traveling during a pandemic exposed people to greater chances of infection. Pilgrims clustered together, slept in communal inns, and shared meals. As a result, they may have unknowingly helped spread the very plague they hoped to escape. Still, the fear of death and the hope of a miracle were powerful motivators. So were the stories that spread across the continent, stories of miraculous healings and divine visions granted to those who had completed their pilgrimages. Whether true or embellished, these tales kept the pilgrim roads busy, even as plague carts filled city streets. Sacred objects were not only visited in distant shrines. Some communities housed their own relics, and these were carried in public processions during times of crisis. Monks or priests would parade through towns with reliquaries held high, chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, and urging the people to repent. Believers lined the streets, kneeling as the objects passed, hoping that a single glance might offer protection. In some towns, the bones of saints were carried around the city's perimeter in an effort to form a spiritual barrier against the plague, an invisible wall of divine energy. Holy relics weren't limited to bones and garments. Some were believed to be items directly linked to miracles: a bottle of St. Walburga's oil, which supposedly oozed healing liquid once a year, a stone touched by St. Michael, or the holy thorn, believed to be part of Christ's crown. These items were displayed during special masses and feast days, and pilgrims gathered from far and wide to witness their power. People also brought personal items to touch against the relics, believing the holy energy could be transferred. Cloths, rings, and tokens touched to a relic were kept as talismans, worn on the body, hidden in clothes, or hung above beds to guard against illness. Sometimes entire households were filled with such objects, forming a kind of spiritual armor in the fight against unseen evil. The line between reverence and superstition blurred easily. Some pilgrims believed that simply looking at a relic could cure them, while others felt the need to sleep near the shrine, kiss the glass of the reliquary, or make offerings of silver coins, wax figures, or hair. These acts weren't seen as bribes, but as humble sacrifices to the divine, gestures of sincerity and hope. Yet, as the plague endured and even intensified in certain waves, cracks began to show in the spiritual logic. For some, the continued spread of disease in spite of all these pilgrimages and relics raised difficult questions. Why, if the bones of saints were so powerful, did towns with the grandest shrines still suffer losses? Why did some of the most devout pilgrims die before they reached their destination? And why, even after relics were paraded through the streets, did the bodies still pile high? Still, the faith did not vanish. Pilgrimages continued throughout the plague years and well beyond. In fact, the plague often prompted a deeper hunger for religious experiences, for divine proximity in a time when human closeness had become dangerous. The touch of a relic, the glimpse of a sacred object, the ache of walking hundreds of miles with blistered feet, all were seen as acts that brought the sufferer one step closer to heaven's mercy. And so, across muddy roads, through forests and over hills, amid war and famine and pestilence, people walked. They walked for hope. They walked for healing. They walked to kneel before a reliquary and whisper a prayer through trembling lips. In an age when medicine failed and reason collapsed under the weight of death, the holy relic stood as a beacon, not just of faith, but of the unquenchable human need to believe that something, somewhere, might still save them. As panic tightened its grip and bodies accumulated faster than the living could bury them, many communities turned to the most brutal of containment measures, sealing the sick in their own homes. The logic, grim and utilitarian, was simple: if the disease could not be cured, perhaps it could be contained. To stop the plague from jumping from house to house, authorities began enforcing orders that confined entire families indoors, often locking them inside and forbidding them to leave under penalty of death. It was a terrifying measure that blurred the line between quarantine and burial, a strategy born not out of cruelty but out of desperation. In cities like London, Venice, and Paris, officials began marking infected houses with ominous signs. Sometimes it was a painted red cross on the door. Sometimes it was a sign that read, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Neighbors would pass by with hushed voices and downcast eyes, knowing that behind the doors were people who were likely already dead or soon would be. In many cases, a watchman was stationed outside to enforce the isolation. These watchmen, often armed and paid little, stood guard day and night, ensuring that no one exited or entered the house. They were the keepers of an invisible line between the sick and the not yet sick, their job both vital and harrowing. Inside, life turned into a grim countdown. Families were left with a meager supply of food and water, delivered occasionally through windows or passed through slits in the door. If they were lucky, someone on the outside, a friend, a priest, or a sympathetic neighbor, might offer aid. But more often than not, fear ruled. Even relatives were wary of helping for fear of infection. Some locked-in families succumbed entirely, the plague taking one member after another until silence fell like a shroud over the house. When this happened, the doors might remain shut for days before anyone dared to enter. The method was not unique to cities. Villages, too, practiced it, though often less formally. In smaller communities where everyone knew each other, decisions to isolate the infected sometimes came from within, either as a heartbreaking act of self-sacrifice or a communal agreement. In some instances, villagers nailed the doors of infected homes shut with boards, sometimes offering prayers as they did so, sometimes walking away in silence, unable to meet the eyes of those left behind. This approach was not always accepted quietly. Some families resisted, fighting the watchman or fleeing in the night before they could be trapped. In major cities, those caught breaking quarantine could be beaten, imprisoned, or even executed. Authorities knew that one person slipping past the seal of an infected house could start a new chain of death in another street, another quarter. So the penalties were harsh. In London, a person caught leaving a plague house unlawfully could be hanged. Fear of punishment, and fear of the disease itself, kept most people inside. There are heartbreaking records from the period that give glimpses into what life was like for the locked-in. In some cases, children were left alone after their parents died, unable to escape or care for themselves. In others, healthy members of the household were sealed in with the sick and, inevitably, became sick themselves. Sometimes, if a plague house had a small garden or backyard, the inhabitants could be seen through a rear gate, ghostly figures waving or silently begging for help that would not come. Religious leaders had mixed feelings about the practice. Some condemned it as inhumane, arguing that it punished the innocent along with the afflicted. Others endorsed it as a form of righteous isolation, a penance or trial sent by God. For many, there was no time to debate the morality of it. The death toll climbed too quickly, the panic spread too fast. To make matters worse, once a home was declared a plague house, it became tainted in the eyes of the community. Even after the quarantine period ended, even if the family survived, the house might be shunned. Neighbors would avoid it, landlords might refuse to rent it again, and its very walls were thought to hold the breath of death. In extreme cases, entire buildings were burned down after the plague had passed through them, not just as a sanitary measure, but as a symbolic act of cleansing. The sealing of plague houses remains one of the starkest examples of how far human societies will go to try and contain disease. It reflects the raw, brutal calculus of survival in a time when medicine had no answers. Behind every door was a story of fear, suffering, and endurance. And while some of those sealed inside perished quietly and anonymously, others lived to tell of it, bearing the memory of darkened rooms, shuttered windows, and the long, slow ticking of time as they waited, day by day, to see who among them would survive. When the plague gripped towns and cities with its invisible, suffocating fingers, the fear of contagion became so great that people began to view not just individuals, but entire streets, districts, and even regions as infected zones, contagious blights that needed to be isolated like a festering wound. As a result, drastic measures were implemented to physically divide communities, block movement, and control the spread of what was still a poorly understood but undeniably lethal force. Across Europe and elsewhere, officials and ordinary people began to erect barriers. Not metaphorical ones, but literal, solid blockades of wood, stone, and earth, to cut off areas believed to be contaminated. These weren't just symbolic efforts. Entire neighborhoods were walled in, gated off, or cordoned with hastily constructed barricades. In many cases, towns built temporary fences out of timber, nailed together quickly by city authorities or panicked citizens. Narrow alleys and side roads were blocked with stones, barrels, or heaps of rubble. In some regions, trenches were dug to create physical divisions between infected and uninfected areas, turning familiar streets into no-man's lands that people dared not cross. This approach was common in places like northern Italy, where some of the earliest formalized public health responses to plague were recorded. Cities such as Milan were famously ruthless in their quarantine strategies. Milanese officials did not hesitate to seal off entire districts at the first sign of plague, sometimes demolishing bridges or collapsing buildings to make sure no one could sneak through. Their tactics were often credited, rightly or wrongly, with saving parts of the city from the worst ravages of the disease, and they became models for similar interventions elsewhere. In London, during the various plague outbreaks that tormented the city in waves over the centuries, authorities sometimes barricaded whole streets. Gates were closed at either end and guarded. Residents of the enclosed area were effectively imprisoned within their own block, and anyone caught attempting to escape risked severe punishment. It became common for these neighborhoods to fall into eerie silence, their bustling life stilled, the homes behind shuttered windows now quiet and shrouded in dread. Sometimes, the only sign of life was the appearance of food or water left at the edge of a blockade by sympathetic outsiders, or, more often, by officials under obligation. In some instances, people within these areas tried to bribe or overpower guards, dig under fences, or even scale walls in desperation. When this happened and the escapes were discovered, the response was swift and often violent. Guards were ordered to shoot or detain those who tried to flee. Communities lived under threat from both the disease and the enforcers of the quarantine. In rural areas, the scale of blockades changed. Some entire villages walled themselves off, refusing to allow travelers in or out. In the most famous example, the English village of Ireham in Derbyshire chose to isolate itself in 1665 after plague arrived via a bundle of cloth delivered from London. Rather than risk spreading the disease to neighbouring towns, the villagers made the extraordinary decision to cut themselves off completely. They set up stone boundary markers around the edge of their village, at which food and supplies could be left by outsiders. No one crossed the boundary either way. Over the course of the epidemic, more than a quarter of the villagers died, but the plague never reached the neighbouring regions, a grim testament to their sacrifice. Larger cities sometimes had more elaborate quarantine structures. In Dubrovnik, then Ragusa, authorities built lazarettos, quarantine stations located outside the city walls, where newcomers had to stay for a period of isolation before being allowed entry. These facilities were separate from the city proper and served as holding areas for travelers, merchants, and sailors. Though not a blockade in the traditional sense, lazarettos functioned similarly, physically separating people suspected of infection from the general population. Sometimes, religious and political leaders reinforced the need for these separations with proclamations or sermons, casting the quarantined areas as places of sin or divine punishment. This added a layer of moral stigma to physical isolation. Those within the blocked-off zones were seen not just as sick, but as spiritually tainted. Fear, already rampant, became laced with contempt and condemnation. For the people on the inside of these barricades, daily life was marked by uncertainty and terror. Supplies ran low. Streets became eerily empty. Sometimes the dead were left where they fell, or pushed into carts by those brave or desperate enough to venture outside. The atmosphere in such places became ghostly, a mix of isolation, despair, and resignation. For those on the outside, the barricades brought a sense of relief and guilt in equal measure. Relief that they might be safe, for now, but guilt that others, often neighbors or relatives, were trapped behind the barriers. The decisions to cut off entire areas were not taken lightly, and they reflected the growing realization that no one, Not rulers, not clergy, not physicians, had any control over the spread of the plague except through raw containment. These makeshift walls, fences, and barricades became symbols of a society stretched to its limits, trying desperately to draw lines between life and death. And though they might have slowed the spread in some cases, they also deepened the sense of division and fear that defined plague life. The barricaded neighborhood, once a vibrant part of the city, became a warning to others of how close the plague always was, and how thin the walls between the living and the doomed had become. In the chaos of a city consumed by plague, its streets eerily silent, the bells tolling endlessly, and the scent of death hanging thick in the air, a new kind of figure emerged in urban life, the plague watchman. These individuals, sometimes hired by the city, sometimes forced into the role by poverty or obligation, were tasked with one of the most thankless and perilous duties imaginable. Their job was to stand guard over plague-stricken houses, to enforce quarantine, and to ensure that those sealed inside, sick, dying, or even still healthy, did not flee and potentially spread the infection further. The role of a plague watchman varied slightly from city to city, but the core responsibilities remained the same: monitor infected households, prevent any unauthorized exits or entries, and report on any developments inside, such as new deaths or signs of worsening conditions. The post required little training, only a grim sense of duty, a willingness to stand near contagion, and the ability to resist the pleas and bribes of desperate residents. It was not a job many wanted. And yet, as fear and mortality rose, someone had to do it. Watchmen were typically positioned outside houses that had been marked with plague signs, crosses painted on the doors, notes indicating quarantine, or in some cases, red flags. These houses were either nailed shut, locked from the outside, or otherwise sealed in a way that made escape difficult. But sealing wasn't enough. Human nature, especially when faced with certain death, often seeks a way out. People tried to run. They begged, cried, even tried to bribe their way free. And it was the watchman's job to stop them. Armed with staffs, sometimes swords, and occasionally even firearms, watchmen acted as both guard and jailer. In some cities, they were issued small weapons for protection, not just from potentially violent quarantined citizens, but from angry neighbors or robbers hoping to loot the homes of the dead. They were given strict orders to allow no one to leave without authorization. And in the more severe outbreaks, they were told to use force if necessary. Violators could be restrained, beaten, or even executed. Some watchmen were rotated regularly, as their job carried high risk of exposure. But many remained in place for days or even weeks at a time, stationed in front of plague houses, often with only minimal shelter. Some were permitted to sleep inside wooden booths or carts placed near the door, or under makeshift awnings. Others simply stood for hours under sun or rain, with only food rations and water occasionally brought to them. In wealthier cities, watchmen might be offered a small sum or extra food as incentive. In poorer places, it was simply assumed that the desperate would take the job no one else wanted. It was not uncommon for watchmen to die on duty, whether from exposure to the elements, violence from frustrated quarantined individuals, or the plague itself. The proximity to plague houses made infection an ever-present threat. Even though they were not typically allowed to enter the homes, the disease had a way of seeping out, through the windows, through whispered breath at a door crack, through contact with infected surfaces. Some wore cloths soaked in vinegar over their mouths. Others carried scented herbs or chewed garlic, hoping. Lingered in the trenches. Some claimed that the plague pits themselves were cursed, and that building on top of one would bring misfortune. Even centuries later, when new buildings or roads were laid, workers sometimes stumbled upon old pits, skeletons still jumbled together beneath the earth, silent witnesses to a forgotten terror. In some cases, authorities tried to document who had died, recording names in hastily compiled plague rolls. But many of these were incomplete or lost to fire, flood, or neglect. The vast majority of plague dead were never identified, never named, and never mourned in the traditional sense. They vanished into the ground by the hundreds of thousands. Modern archaeology has only recently begun to uncover the extent of these mass burials. In cities like London, Marseille, and Lubeck, excavations have revealed pits filled with dozens or even hundreds of plague victims, still arranged in the layered patterns described in medieval texts. Analysis of these remains has provided valuable insight into how people lived, died, and were treated during the plague years. But beyond the scientific and historical value, The plague pits serve as a haunting reminder of the scale of human loss. Each skeleton represents a life ended too soon, a person who may have been a parent, a child, a lover, or a laborer. Together, they paint a picture not only of the disease's cruelty, but of a society overwhelmed by its own mortality, forced to abandon ceremony and embrace survival. In the end, mass graves were a symbol of a world pushed past its limits. They were a grim compromise between dignity and necessity, reverence and practicality. They stood as open wounds in the cities and villages that dug them, deep, silent, and filled with the forgotten. As the plague tightened its grip on cities and towns, fear became the dominant emotion guiding public policy. The realization that the disease spread rapidly among people, particularly in crowds, led authorities across Europe and beyond to take drastic and often heartbreaking measures. Among the most emotionally jarring of these was the cancellation of funerals and public gatherings, severing communities from the rituals that had long offered comfort in times of loss and crisis. In times before the plague, funerals were deeply embedded in the fabric of communal and religious life. When someone died, it was expected, regardless of their social status, that family and friends would gather, offer prayers, mourn publicly, and walk in solemn procession to the place of burial. These ceremonies were both spiritual and social. They offered not only religious closure, with rites said for the soul of the deceased, but also emotional release for the living. Funerals helped reaffirm community bonds, allowing people to come together to remember the dead, support the bereaved, and collectively confront mortality. But when the plague came, all of this changed. Almost overnight, gatherings of any kind were seen not as necessary acts of mourning but as dangerous assemblies that could accelerate the spread of death. Municipal councils, religious authorities, and monarchs issued strict bans. Funerals, church services, and community events were either severely limited or entirely forbidden. These bans were not based on a modern understanding of pathogens or germ theory, neither of which existed at the time, but on an empirical observation. Where people gathered, the plague often followed. It was known that entire neighborhoods could be wiped out shortly after market day, festival, or funeral procession. The logic was harsh but straightforward. To save the living, they must give up the rituals of the dead. In many cities, decrees were posted announcing that no more than a handful of people, often only close family or gravediggers, were allowed to attend a burial. Priests, once central to funeral rites, were now hard to find. Many had fled or died, and those who remained were often reluctant to perform last rites or conduct services for fear of contagion. In extreme cases, burials were carried out in complete silence, without a word of prayer or the comfort of sacred ceremony. People who had lost loved ones often had to say goodbye from a distance. Corpses were taken away not by family, but by plague workers or city-appointed collectors. Bodies were frequently wrapped in cloth and taken out at night, placed in carts along with others, and transported directly to mass graves. The mourners, if they were even allowed to watch, stood far back, covering their faces, unable to speak or weep openly for fear of drawing unwanted attention or punishment. The psychological toll of these cancelled funerals was immense. In societies where death was often understood through a religious lens, where salvation, purgatory, and the afterlife were tied to rites and prayers, being denied a proper burial was more than tragic. It was terrifying. Many people believed that a soul without the proper prayers or masses might be condemned to wander or suffer in the afterlife. The absence of ritual meant the dead were left not only physically unburied but spiritually untethered. Weddings, too, were banned or postponed indefinitely. Markets and feast days, so central to social life and local economies, were shut down. Religious festivals were cancelled, despite the fact that many believed they could invoke divine mercy. Parades, town meetings, even simple gatherings at public fountains or town squares became rare or forbidden. In some areas, armed guards were stationed outside churches and city gates to enforce these bans, punishing those who defied the orders. In places where the plague struck again and again over the years, such as in Italy, France, and England, these bans were periodically lifted and reimposed. This created a bizarre rhythm of public life: short, cautious returns to communal events followed by fresh outbreaks and renewed restrictions. The unpredictability wore people down. Generations grew up knowing that weddings might be cancelled at a moment's notice, and that loved ones might die and vanish without a farewell. This social isolation did not just affect the general public. Nobles and royals, too, were subject to the same fears. Kings, queens, bishops, and wealthy merchants postponed public ceremonies, coronations, and feast days. Entire courts relocated to remote areas in an attempt to escape the threat. In some cases, even members of the nobility were buried quickly and without pageantry, their titles offering no protection from the pragmatic cruelty of plague-era protocols. Despite the bans, some people attempted to hold secret ceremonies. There are recorded instances of underground funerals conducted at night, with whispered prayers and hastily dug graves in family gardens. Others bribed priests to perform rites in secret or carried out ceremonies themselves, using memorized prayers and homemade altars. These acts of resistance were not just about tradition, they were acts of love, desperation, and faith in the face of unimaginable loss. Still, for the most part, society obeyed the restrictions. The risk was too great. Entire towns had been wiped out when people gathered in large numbers. The consequences of one funeral could ripple outward, infecting dozens or hundreds. Fear became stronger than grief, and safety replaced ceremony as the priority. But the emotional void left by this absence of ritual would haunt communities for generations. The psychological scars of having to watch loved ones die and vanish without a moment of shared mourning lingered long after the last case of plague had disappeared. The silence, the isolation, the inability to say goodbye, these wounds were not easily healed. Historians looking back at these cancellations often note the deep humanity that underlies the bans. Though they seem cold and ruthless, these measures were made with the hope of preserving life. Yet they came at a price. The price was the communal heart of society, its celebrations, its grief, its togetherness. In cutting out the gatherings, the plague severed not just bodies, but bonds. And in doing so, it revealed how vital those connections are, not only in life, but in death. As the plague continued its relentless march across towns and cities, wiping out thousands and terrifying the living into desperate acts of self-preservation, a new wave of activity stirred in the narrow lanes and marketplaces, those of the apothecaries and street healers. These figures, both respected and distrusted, emerged as vital players in the chaotic, uncertain world of plague medicine. Their presence was as visible as the masked plague doctors or the robed priests. They were the ones people turned to when they had no options left, when the physicians had fled, the clergy had given up, and hope was fading. Apothecaries, the forerunners of modern pharmacists, occupied a strange middle ground in medieval society. They were not formally trained physicians, but they weren't charlatans either, at least not always. Many had years of experience in crafting medicinal concoctions from herbs, minerals, and animal parts. They relied on ancient recipes, oral traditions, and experimentation. Their shops were crowded with shelves of dried plants, glass jars, strange powders, oils, and pickled animal parts. The air within these spaces was heavy with the scent of camphor, myrrh, and bitter roots. It was here, in these dimly lit, pungent rooms, that mixtures were ground, boiled, and poured into bottles, each promising some form of hope. When the plague hit, business boomed. Fear was the greatest customer. People flooded to apothecaries seeking anything that might prevent or cure the disease. Some sought preventative tonics, drinks meant to strengthen the body and protect against infection. Others came in frantic desperation, needing something, anything, to help a loved one already showing signs of illness. Often, the concoctions were priced according to urgency, rarity of ingredients, or sheer demand. The more terrified the people, the more valuable the potion. Among the most popular items sold were plague waters, herbal distillations made from ingredients like wormwood, angelica, and juniper. These were either drunk or dabbed onto the skin. Some were burned and inhaled. Many apothecaries claimed their plague waters could cleanse the body of corruption or guard against bad air. There were also lozenges made from licorice and honey, pastes for anointing the chest, and medicinal wines infused with herbs like sage, rosemary, and rue. Garlic was common in nearly every mixture, believed to be a powerful natural cleanser. Street healers, unlike apothecaries, often had no permanent premises. They were more transient, setting up makeshift booths in markets, or walking through alleys with their goods dangling from belts or carried in baskets. Some wore colorful robes or strange hats to make themselves stand out. Many would cry out loudly, hawking their latest cure or boasting of their remedy's miraculous effects. These healers sometimes sold similar mixtures to the apothecaries, but often added a layer of mysticism or showmanship to their sales pitch. A street healer might claim their tonic had been revealed to them in a dream or was blessed by a saint. Others sold charms alongside their medicine: dried toad powder to ward off evil spirits, small stones that had supposedly fallen from the heavens, or vials containing the ashes of purified herbs mixed with holy water. The lines between physical, spiritual, and magical healing blurred heavily at this level. People didn't care whether the remedy made sense, they just wanted to believe in something. And the street healers, clever and opportunistic, were always ready to supply both the potion and the story that made it believable. Despite their popularity, both apothecaries and street healers faced skepticism and even hostility. When a remedy failed, which was often, the blame fell hard. Families accused healers of fraud. Clergy sometimes labeled them as quacks or even heretics, especially if they veered too far into the realm of magic or sold charms resembling pagan talismans. Some were fined, imprisoned, or run out of town. Others vanished quietly when an outbreak worsened, only to reappear weeks later under a different name, with new concoctions for sale. Still, many apothecaries genuinely believed in their work and followed principles inherited from ancient Greek, Roman, or Arabic sources. They referred to texts by Galen, Hippocrates, or Avicenna, modifying old recipes with locally available ingredients. There were even organized guilds in certain regions that regulated who could call themselves an apothecary, what could be sold, and how remedies were made. In cities like Florence or London, these guilds had records of recipes, protocols for mixing, and even lists of restricted or dangerous substances. But plague years shattered much of that structure. Rules were bent. Guidelines ignored. Demand was too overwhelming. Supplies ran out. Ingredients became scarce and expensive. Dried herbs that were once common were now imported at high cost, if they could be found at all. Some sellers resorted to diluting their tonics, replacing rare ingredients with cheaper substitutes, or outright lying about what was in a remedy. This grey zone between genuine care and exploitative opportunism became increasingly difficult to distinguish. A common feature of apothecary shops during the plague was the so-called plague shelf, a visible, prominent area where the most sought-after cures were placed. These included items like powdered unicorn horn, often just crushed bone, bezoar stones from animal stomachs, and theriac, a legendary ancient cure-all made from dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh. Theriac was extremely expensive and often adulterated, but its reputation persisted for centuries. People believed it could cure anything from snake bites to the Black Death itself. There were also more humble and localized remedies: poultices made from mashed onions and butter, elixirs infused with vinegar and lavender, or pastes crafted from sage and salt. Each community had its own traditions, its own wise women or elderly men known for making a particular salve that had once helped during the last outbreak. These local healers, who straddled the line between folklore and medicine, were especially important in rural areas where trained apothecaries were rare or non-existent. Often using knowledge passed down through generations, they made salves, syrups, and teas that provided not only potential relief but a connection to something older, more grounded in the land itself. People trusted them not because they had degrees or credentials, but because their remedies were familiar, homegrown, and rooted in the community's collective memory. It would be easy to dismiss all these remedies as useless or quaint. And yes, many of them had no effect on the plague. But in a world where understanding of disease was limited, and modern antibiotics or vaccines didn't exist, these apothecaries and street healers offered something invaluable: hope. They provided the illusion of control in a time when death was random, invisible, and unstoppable. They gave people something to hold on to, swallow, rub on the skin, or place under a pillow, something that made them feel like they were doing something to fight back. This emotional role cannot be overstated. The healing process is as much psychological as it is physical. A bitter potion, even if it had no medicinal value, could give courage. A pouch of herbs around the neck might allow someone to walk through a plague-stricken alley with a little less fear. And that sense of agency, however small, was worth its weight in gold. As strange as it might sound to modern ears, dancing, yes, frenzied, uncontrollable, and often ritualistic dancing, was believed by some to be a cure, or at least a form of protection, against the plague. In the midst of suffering, death, and widespread panic, the human spirit sought outlets not only for survival but for release. Dancing, already woven into the social and religious fabric of medieval life, took on a peculiar and desperate new role during times of pestilence. This belief in dancing as a healing or protective act wasn't born entirely out of the plague era. It was connected to older folkloric and spiritual traditions, some dating back centuries. Across Europe, stories were told of Saint Vitus and Saint John, both associated with dancing-induced ecstasies. The so-called Saint Vitus dance, known today in a medical context as Sydenhamschorea, was a term that, in medieval times, became intermingled with tales of hysterical, infectious dancing that swept across towns like a storm. During plague outbreaks, when death seemed to hover in the very air and the tolling of funeral bells never ceased, such behavior escalated. People danced in the streets, in churches, on bridges, or in town squares. But this was no orderly folk dance or graceful procession. This was manic, often chaotic movement, uncontrolled and unrelenting. In some cases, it lasted for hours, days, even weeks. Entire groups would dance together, driven by a shared, inexplicable energy. Their feet bled, their bodies collapsed, yet they would rise again or be replaced by others. These bizarre spectacles are recorded in places like Aachen in Germany in 1374, Strasbourg in 1518, and several other European towns where outbreaks of dancing mania were documented in periods of profound fear and suffering. What made people think that dancing might help cure the plague? The reasoning, if it could be called that, was a tangled mix of superstition, psychological release, spiritual desperation, and even a belief in the physical expulsion of illness through motion. One theory held that plague was caused by evil spirits or demons that possessed the body, causing disease. Dancing, in this interpretation, was a way to shake them out, to force these malevolent forces to exit through sweat, convulsions, or ecstatic movement. Just as other rituals attempted to purge or appease divine or cosmic wrath, dancing became a kinetic ritual of release. Another belief, more subtle, was rooted in the idea of blood circulation and bodily balance, concepts loosely tied to the humoral theory. Dancing got the blood moving, made the body sweat, and perhaps, people reasoned, it expelled the infected vapors or corrected internal imbalances. It was like sweating out a fever, a crude but intuitive idea. Some thought dancing in rhythm or under a specific patron saint's image would invoke divine protection or blessing. In towns where saints were venerated as protectors from disease, dancing was sometimes offered as a form of living prayer or penance. Not all dance was uncontrolled mania. In some communities, dancing was organized. Local authorities, recognizing the popularity of the practice, sometimes hired musicians to lead the dancing, hoping to channel the hysteria into something less chaotic. Processions were held where dancers moved in circles, clapped hands, and followed choreographed routines. These healing dances were often accompanied by music, chanting, or singing, and participants might carry banners of saints or wear specific colors associated with healing. Still, there was a fine line between communal catharsis and public panic. In many places, this dancing mania frightened onlookers. It was difficult to tell whether participants were joyful, mad, or possessed. Authorities were often unsure how to respond. In some towns, dancers were rounded up and confined, believing they might spread more than rhythm. In others, they were led to churches or shrines where priests attempted to exorcise the cause of the frenzy. In a few recorded instances, people were even beaten in the hope that violence would snap them out of the trance. There are records of towns that attempted to cure the dancers by leading them to specific places thought to be spiritually potent. In Strasbourg, during the 1518 episode of dancing mania, the afflicted were taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus in hopes of divine intervention. There, they were blessed, given special shoes, or had their feet washed in holy water. Sometimes this worked, at least temporarily, though modern historians suggest many of these people were suffering from psychological trauma, mass hysteria, or even neurological illness exacerbated by starvation and stress. This wasn't limited to isolated incidents. Over time, dancing was absorbed into the wider plague folklore as something both feared and revered. In some regions, it was believed that dancing during certain hours or on specific days, especially religious feast days, could avert illness. In others, dancing was avoided entirely, thought to attract misfortune or demonic attention if done improperly or disrespectfully. There's also the element of simple human desperation. When nothing worked, when leeches, potions, prayers, and fumigations. All failed. People turned to anything that made them feel alive. And what is more alive than dancing, than the movement of one's own body, than the rhythmic thud of feet against the earth? In the face of incomprehensible death, this raw expression of physicality became a kind of defiance, a statement that I am still here, even if only for a moment longer. The church and many learned figures, however, often disapproved. They saw the dancing as indecent, chaotic, and spiritually dangerous. Some preachers warned that dancing invited demons or stirred up lustful feelings that would draw divine punishment. Others saw it as a form of collective madness, sinful hysteria that signaled a society out of control. There were attempts to outlaw dancing during plague times, especially when it began to resemble mass gatherings, which were believed to spread the disease. But enforcement was inconsistent, and in some places, it only made the practice more attractive. It's difficult to overstate how strange these scenes must have looked, a town half devastated by plague, the streets heavy with the stench of decay, yet in the center, a circle of people moving in wild rhythm, some laughing, some crying, some collapsing in exhaustion. The dead were carted away by the dozens, but in that small, frantic circle, there was motion, music, and the faintest echo of joy, or perhaps madness. Modern scholars debate what exactly was happening during these outbreaks of plague-time dancing. Some suggest it was an early form of psychosomatic response to stress, what we might today classify as mass psychogenic illness. Others see it as a survival mechanism, a cultural expression of trauma. Whatever the cause, to the people living through it, the dancing was real, and for many, it was seen as a lifeline, a cure, or at least a momentary escape from the crushing weight of death. In the tapestry of plague responses, dancing stands out as a deeply human reaction, part irrational, part spiritual, part desperate grasp at meaning. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, people seek not only survival but expression, not only medicine but movement, and not only answers but release. When fear overwhelms a community and rational explanations fail to bring comfort, people often turn to scapegoats. During the long centuries of plague outbreaks, most notably the Black Death of the 14th century and its recurrences throughout Europe, fear and confusion led many to believe that the disease was not merely a natural disaster, but the result of deliberate, malevolent acts. And so, in towns and villages across Europe, accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, and dark magic arose like a toxic mist, fueling waves of persecution against those deemed suspicious, different, or unlucky enough to be blamed. In the medieval worldview, especially among common folk, magic was not a distant superstition but an everyday possibility. It lived in the whispers of the wind, in a neighbor's glance, in a strange dream or unexplained illness. Magic could heal, but it could also harm. So when plague struck and wiped out entire communities with such ruthless efficiency, it didn't seem like an accident. It felt personal. People began to look around and ask, who among us brought this evil here? Accusations of plague-bringing witchcraft often targeted individuals already on the margins of society. Elderly women living alone, midwives with herbal knowledge, foreigners, the poor, or those with odd habits. Anyone who didn't fit neatly into the norms of the local community could become suspect. If a person happened to have survived while others around them died, if their house was untouched by illness, if their animals seemed healthy when the rest were rotting in the fields, that alone might be enough to stir suspicions. How could they have avoided the wrath of the plague unless they had some pact with dark forces? In some places, accusations were directed at people thought to have cast curses or brewed potions to summon the plague. The logic was circular and cruel. A woman with jars of dried herbs might be said to be concocting magical poisons. A man who muttered prayers under his breath might be accused of calling demons. If someone was seen scattering powders or sprinkling water, a practice not uncommon among herbalists or local healers, they might be charged with attempting to spread disease deliberately. The symbols of folk healing, bundles of herbs, mysterious books, strange symbols, were often indistinguishable from the symbols of witchcraft in the minds of frightened villagers. In extreme cases, whole groups of people were accused of intentionally causing the plague. Sometimes they were said to be making pacts with the devil in dark rituals, summoning the sickness to afflict humanity as part of some demonic agenda. There were rumors of witches meeting in sabbats, where they would cast wide-reaching spells or anoint objects with disease. These stories spread faster than fire, especially when the actual cause of disease remained unknown and people demanded some explanation, any explanation, for the chaos around them. The authorities, both religious and secular, often took such accusations seriously. Inquisitors, magistrates, and even local priests would initiate investigations based on little more than hearsay. Torture was widely used to extract confessions. Under enough pain and terror, accused individuals might admit to anything, flying through the night to attend a witches' gathering, speaking to the devil, or casting spells with plague-infested items. These confessions were taken as proof not only of individual guilt but of widespread conspiracies. The result was a cycle of arrests, fear, and public executions. Executions of those accused of plague witchcraft could be brutal. Hanging and burning were the most common methods, meant not only to punish but to purify. Entire communities might gather to witness the spectacle, convinced that it would cleanse their town of the unseen evil. The spectacle of a witch burning was as much about fear and control as it was about justice, a desperate performance to show that people were doing something to fight back against the invisible killer in their midst. The link between witches and the plague grew especially strong during later waves of the Black Death and during the witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries. Witchcraft manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious guidebook for hunting and prosecuting witches, suggested that witches could cause plagues and other widespread calamities through their dark arts. These ideas helped solidify the association in the public imagination. Disease wasn't just the work of nature or divine wrath, it could be an act of evil intent. The plague also overlapped with other social tensions that made witchcraft accusations more likely. Economic hardship, food shortages, war, and religious strife all fed into a sense of societal breakdown. In such times, marginalized people became easy targets. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a way to exert power, settle old grudges, or explain away tragedies. The plague, in its randomness and horror, gave those accusations both urgency and seeming legitimacy. Witchcraft accusations were not confined only to the lower classes or remote villages. Even in cities and royal courts, whispers of sorcery and plague-spreading rituals sometimes surfaced. In Italy, France, Germany, and elsewhere, records show trials and interrogations of individuals suspected of summoning the plague through occult means. These accusations were sometimes linked to political or religious tensions, with enemies accused of harnessing supernatural forces to weaken or destroy their rivals. Even Jews and other minorities were tragically swept into this net of suspicion. During the Black Death, Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease. These libels often combined with pre-existing anti-Semitism to justify horrific pogroms and massacres. The idea of deliberate plague spreading, of someone consciously unleashing death, was so compelling, so emotionally charged, that it often overrode reason entirely. In many cases, the accused were simply unfortunate. They were the ones who looked different, believed differently, or survived when others did not. Their fates, torture, confession, execution, serve as chilling reminders of how deeply fear can warp justice, how easily communities turn against their own in search of someone to blame. It's important to recognize, too, that some people genuinely believed they were cursed. If a person lost their entire family, if their livestock died and their fields withered, they might begin to think they had been targeted by a witch. The cultural atmosphere was so saturated with belief in magical causality that misfortune almost demanded a mystical explanation. People didn't just fear witches, they feared becoming the victims of witchcraft. And so, in the annals of plague history, the image of the witch looms large, not as the actual cause of disease, but as a tragic scapegoat for a terrified society. While rats, fleas, and bacteria were the true agents of the Black Death, it was the accused witches, beaten, burned, or banished, who paid the price in human suffering. These accusations speak volumes about the mindset of the time, a deep desire to understand the incomprehensible, to find order in chaos, and to believe that if someone caused the plague, then perhaps someone could also stop it. Witchcraft accusations were, in essence, a cry of despair, a desperate attempt to make sense of senseless death. But they also reveal the dark side of human fear, how it can destroy reason, shatter communities, and consume the innocent. Among the many curious and colorful legends to emerge from the plague years, one of the most enduring is the tale of the Four Thieves' Vinegar, a story that sits somewhere between folk magic and early chemistry, between desperate survival and enterprising myth. It is a story whispered through centuries of fear and survival, always returning in times of pestilence, like the scent of the vinegar itself, sharp, strange, and oddly hopeful. The legend goes like this. During one of the many outbreaks of the bubonic plague, most often said to be in 17th century France, though some versions date it earlier to the 14th century, a group of thieves began to make a name for themselves in a most disturbing way. While the rest of the city was dying in droves and terrified citizens locked themselves away, these men roamed freely through the plague-stricken streets. But they weren't offering aid or helping to bury the dead. No, they were robbing the corpses. These thieves would enter the homes of the dead and dying, stealing valuables, clothing, jewelry, anything worth taking. They plundered the homes of plague victims, touching their bodies, rifling through blooded bedding, walking through rooms rank with disease. And yet, somehow, they didn't get sick. While others collapsed after so much as breathing the infected air, the thieves moved from house to house seemingly untouched by the deadly Black Death. This, naturally, caught the attention of the authorities. Eventually, the legend says, the thieves were caught. They were arrested and sentenced to death for their crimes. But the judges, fascinated, perhaps even desperate, offered them a grim bargain. If they would reveal the secret to their plague resistance, they would be granted a more merciful death, perhaps even a pardon. The thieves agreed and disclosed their recipe, a potent mixture of herbs and vinegar, soaked together to make a powerful solution they used as a wash and inhalant. The exact ingredients vary depending on the source, but traditional recipes for Four Thieves vinegar include strong, pungent herbs thought to protect against disease and bad air. These often included rosemary, thyme, sage, lavender, mint, wormwood, rue, and garlic, especially garlic, which was seen almost universally as a powerful protector against illness. The herbs were steeped in vinegar for days or weeks, creating a bitter, sharp-smelling infusion that was then used to bathe the body, wash hands, or soak cloths that could be worn over the face. Some sources even claim that the thieves drank the vinegar or used it to clean surfaces they touched. This remedy quickly passed into popular use, becoming a folk medicine in plague-ridden cities across Europe. Apothecaries began preparing their own versions, often under names like Vinegar of the Four Thieves or Marseille's vinegar. People soaked cloth in it and held it to their faces as they walked through infected areas. Doctors and nurses used it to clean instruments or their hands. Some households even kept bottles of it on hand for purifying rooms or refreshing the air. The idea behind the vinegar was not entirely without merit. Vinegar itself is acidic and can kill some bacteria on contact. Many of the herbs in the mixture, particularly garlic and rosemary, do possess antimicrobial properties. Lavender and mint helped mask unpleasant odors, which people at the time associated with disease. And in an era when miasma theory dominated, that is, the belief that plague spread through foul, poisonous air, anything that smelled sharp or clean was considered potentially protective. But more than its actual ingredients, the Four Thieves vinegar captured something deeper, the hope that there was a way to resist the seemingly unstoppable. In a time when people were powerless against disease, the story of the vinegar offered a formula, a method, a ritual, something to do, something to believe in. It was more than medicine. It was magic, folklore, and defiance bottled up into a single remedy. Over the centuries, the recipe for Four Thieves vinegar was passed down, sometimes in whispered tones, sometimes written into old herbal manuscripts. Different regions developed their own variations. Some added cloves or cinnamon. Others used red wine vinegar instead of white. Some soaked the herbs for exactly 14 days. Others swore by only 7. But always, it was said to be a plague fighter, a ward against death. Even into the modern era, Four Thieves vinegar remained in use among herbalists and traditional healers. During later disease outbreaks, such as cholera in the 19th century or even influenza in the early 20th, it made appearances again. In some rural parts of Europe and North America, the remedy still lingers as a home recipe, often associated with protection, cleansing, and resilience. In the 21st century, herbalists and holistic health enthusiasts continue to make versions of Four Thieves vinegar, now more often used as an immune booster or surface cleaner than a literal plague defense. Some interpretations of the story turn the thieves into apothecaries themselves, suggesting they weren't common criminals, but cunning herbalists who used their knowledge to survive and even profit from the plague. Others speculate that the tale was created by apothecaries themselves as a marketing tool, spinning a gripping story around their latest medicinal blend. In that sense, Four Thieves vinegar might be one of history's first branded health tonics, equal parts fear, mystery, and commerce. Whether or not the thieves existed, or whether their recipe actually saved them, matters less than the role the story played in the culture of the plague. It represented ingenuity amid desperation, and the belief that even in a world ruled by death, there might be clever ways to slip through the cracks. It gave people something to mix, to prepare, to trust in, a little potion of control in a sea of chaos. So when we speak of the many ways people tried to cure or protect themselves from the plague, for thieves' vinegar stands out, not because it was miraculous, but because it was memorable. It showed how the line between medicine and myth is often blurred, especially when fear is great and knowledge is scarce. And in the sharp scent of that vinegar, steeped in lore and legend, we find not only a window into medieval healing but a glimpse into the human spirit's refusal to surrender, even to the Black Death itself. As the plague tore through the cities and countrysides of medieval Europe, leaving death in its wake and silencing even the busiest towns, many people turned their eyes heavenward in desperate search of meaning. When science failed, and medicine stumbled, religion filled the void with interpretations as old as civilization itself. For countless souls caught in the path of the plague, the terrible disease was not merely a medical crisis, it was a spiritual reckoning. It was seen not as a natural occurrence, but as divine intervention, a punishment for sin, or a test sent from God to purify, humble, or awaken mankind. This belief was not an isolated notion among the deeply religious but was a widespread and deeply ingrained worldview in medieval society. Christianity, which dominated most of Europe, emphasized the fallen nature of man and the inevitability of divine justice. Sin, in this view, had real consequences, both in the afterlife and, crucially, in the present world. Famine, floods, wars, and plagues were often interpreted as God's judgment for human wickedness. The plague, especially in its brutal swiftness and scale, was the ultimate expression of that judgment. To the medieval mind, the Black Death was a terrifying but understandable consequence of humanity's failure to live according to divine law. It arrived not as a random act of nature, but as a purposeful scourge, a correction sent from above to remind mankind of its moral failings. Entire communities scoured their collective conscience. What had they done to deserve such wrath? Was it greed? These questions were not mere abstractions. They fueled sermons, filled public squares, and drove people to change their behavior, often dramatically. Priests and monks preached fire and brimstone. They warned their flocks that the plague was God's voice thundering from the heavens, a divine trumpet announcing that the time of repentance was at hand. In their eyes, the plague was not just a punishment, but also a chance, a brutal mercy that, if met with humility, could lead to spiritual renewal. Some theologians went further, framing the plague as a test. Just as Job had suffered in the Old Testament without having sinned, perhaps the plague was a crucible through which souls could be purified. It was a time for deep reflection, for surrender to God's will. The righteous, they believed, would either be spared or rewarded in the next life. Those who died of the plague were seen by some as martyrs, cleansed by suffering. In this view, death itself was not the end, but a transition, and the plague was simply the dark gate through which the faithful passed into eternity. Among ordinary people, these ideas took root and blossomed in 1,000 forms. Families gathered to pray, not just for health, but for forgiveness. People wept in churches, confessing their sins aloud. Processions of the devout walked barefoot through city streets, singing hymns, carrying crosses, begging for God's mercy. Some whipped themselves in public displays of penance, hoping to demonstrate their repentance through physical suffering, an idea that would grow into the widespread flagellant movement. Others gave away their wealth, abandoned their homes, or entered monasteries in a last-ditch attempt to align their souls with divine favor. This belief in the plague as a spiritual test also shaped how people responded to the sick. While fear often led to abandonment and isolation, for some, ministering to the dying became a sacred duty. Monks and nuns tended to plague victims even at the risk of their own lives, believing that by serving the suffering, they were serving Christ himself. For these men and women, the plague was not just a trial, it was a calling, an opportunity to live out the Christian ideal of selfless love. Of course, not everyone agreed on what specific sins had brought about God's wrath. This led to bitter divisions and sometimes tragic consequences. Heretics, Jews, foreigners, and the poor were often scapegoated, accused of bringing down divine anger on the community. In this twisted logic, punishing these groups became a form of atonement, an attempt to cleanse the community of its impurities and win back God's favor. Entire Jewish communities were massacred under such accusations, victims of a moral panic that mistook cruelty for piety. Even the elite were not immune to this worldview. Kings and queens held public days of prayer and fasting. City leaders organized religious processions and called for mass confession. Laws were passed to enforce moral behavior, including bans on gambling, drinking, and prostitution. Civic leaders hoped that by cleaning up their cities spiritually, they might halt the spread of the disease. In a world with limited understanding of germs, infection, or transmission, these spiritual explanations provided not only meaning but structure. They offered a lens through which people could understand their suffering, and even gain a sense of agency. If the plague was a punishment, then repentance might offer protection. If it was a test, then faith might offer salvation. Either way, the faithful were not powerless. They could pray, confess, fast, and purify their lives in the hope of divine intervention. And yet, the plague's indiscriminate cruelty often challenged this faith. When priests died by the hundreds, when babies succumbed just as quickly as the wicked, when churches were emptied by the very plague they claimed could be avoided through prayer, it forced some to question. Why would God punish the innocent? Why would the pious perish alongside the sinful? For a few, the plague became a source not of spiritual renewal, but of disillusionment. Faith was not abandoned lightly, but some began to wonder if perhaps the old answers no longer applied. Still, for most, the framework of spiritual interpretation held firm. It shaped not only how people lived and died during the plague, but how they remembered it afterward. Chronicles, religious texts, and personal letters preserved the belief that the Black Death was a divine message, a warning, a test, or a final chance for redemption. And even centuries later, echoes of that belief remain, in the prayers said during pandemics, in the rituals of cleansing and repentance, and in the enduring search for meaning in the face of suffering. As the shadow of the plague stretched across continents and generations, leaving untold millions dead in its wake, what endured as strongly as the disease itself was the story of how humanity responded. From the most elaborate religious ceremonies to the most bizarre home-brewed potions, from bloodletting and burning herbs to locking entire families inside their homes, these cures, treatments, and rituals tell us far more than just the history of medicine. They open a window into the rawest corners of the human soul. They reveal how people thought, how they feared, how they hoped, and most of all, how desperately they clung to life even when surrounded by death. There's something deeply human in every remedy attempted during the plague, no matter how absurd or gruesome. Consider the mothers who smeared their children with vinegar, believing it might purify them. Or the doctors who braved contagion dressed in heavy leather and beaked masks filled with fragrant herbs. Or the villagers who placed live chickens on their sores in the vain hope that a bird might draw out the poison. These weren't acts of foolishness. They were acts of courage, of belief, of grasping at any thread of control in a world that had unraveled. Even the most irrational cures were often born not from ignorance alone, but from desperation, a desperation to survive, to save a child, to protect a loved one. At the heart of these responses lies a profound truth. When faced with an invisible and unstoppable killer, people will do almost anything to regain a sense of agency. Medieval society didn't have the germ theory of disease. They didn't have antibiotics or vaccines. They had no understanding of vectors or transmission or even hygiene as we now define it. But they had centuries of tradition, religious teachings, philosophical frameworks, and a vast oral culture of remedies and rituals passed down through generations. So they turned to what they knew, or thought they knew. Some looked to the skies, blaming planetary alignments. Others searched their conscience, seeing God's judgment. Many looked to the body itself, trying to balance humors, remove bad blood, or draw out the poison through poultices and incisions. Others turned outward, sealing borders, watching homes, building walls around their towns, and setting fire to the very air in the hopes of driving out whatever invisible demon had taken hold. Some danced, some prayed, some blamed neighbors or strangers. In doing so, they stitched together a patchwork of meaning where reason and science had yet to provide answers. And there is tragedy in that, but also a strange kind of heroism. Because even amid the chaos, something else shines through: resilience. People did not simply give up and die. They innovated, however clumsily. They treated, even without understanding. They created roles like plague watchmen, built quarantine stations, experimented with herbal mixtures, and enforced lockdowns long before public health became a science. Much of it didn't work. Some of it made things worse. But every ritual, every herb, every prayer, these were signs that people still believed there might be a way through. That even in a world soaked with death, life still mattered enough to fight for. These cures and practices also reveal just how deeply fear can shape a society. Fear of the unknown. Fear of punishment. Fear of others. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it warped minds, broke communities, and sometimes led to horrifying acts of cruelty. The persecution of Jews, the blaming of witches, the abandonment of the sick, these are also part of the story, reminders that fear can make people turn on one another in search of scapegoats when answers are scarce. But alongside that darkness, there was also compassion. Countless priests, nuns, and caregivers died not in retreat but in service. People risked their lives to tend to others. Strangers fed the sick through windows, neighbors dropped bread on doorsteps, and families knelt together to pray when hope was all they had left. Even amid ignorance and superstition, empathy endured. The human spirit, though battered, refused to be completely extinguished. Ultimately, these plague cures reveal a world grappling not just with disease, but with the very nature of suffering. What does it mean to live when death surrounds you? How do you make sense of a world turned upside down? And what lengths will you go to in order to protect the ones you love? The answers echo across centuries. Today, we might scoff at vinegar-soaked clothes or scented amulets. We may shake our heads at leeches and live chickens and bleeding veins. But we, too, have faced invisible enemies. We, too, have felt the cold breath of panic during modern pandemics. And we, too, have turned to whatever tools, traditions, and beliefs we had to survive. In that way, we are not so different from the people who walked through plague-ridden Europe, clutching rosaries or herbs or bottles of urine. The costumes may have changed. The science may have advanced. But the emotions, the fear, the hope, the love, the will to survive, remain as deeply human as ever. The story of how people tried to cure the plague is not just a chronicle of medieval medicine. It is a mirror, reflecting our deepest instincts and our most desperate hopes. And as long as we continue to face challenges as a species, we will keep writing new versions of this old story, of how humanity, in its most fragile moments, still refuses to surrender to the darkness. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.